Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I need people to understand something about what happened to me last summer in the Ozark National Forest. I'm 32, work as an electrician in Little Rock, and I've been hiking solo for about 8 years now. That Saturday in late June started like any other weekend trip. I'd driven out early, parked at a lesser-known trailhead about 40 miles from town, and planned to do a 15-mile loop through some backcountry sections that barely see any foot traffic. The heat was already building by 9 in the morning, that thick Arkansas humidity that makes your shirt stick to your back within minutes. I had my usual gear, lightweight pack, 2 liters of water, some jerky and trail mix, my GPS unit, and a small fixed-blade knife on my belt. The first few miles were peaceful, just me and the sound of cicadas screaming in the trees, the occasional rustling of squirrels, and my boots crunching on the dry pine needles that carpeted the trail. Around noon, I decided to veer off trail for a bit to check out a creek I could hear running somewhere below the ridge I was on. That's when everything went sideways. After bushwhacking down a steep slope for maybe 20 minutes, fighting through thorny vines and dodging spider webs, I pushed through a thick wall of mountain laurel and stumbled right into what looked like someone's camp. But this wasn't your typical backpacker's setup with ultralight gear and leave-no-trace ethics. There were at least 6 or 7 makeshift tents made from blue tarps and rope strung between trees, a fire pit still smoldering with fresh coals, clothes hanging on lines, and trash everywhere. Empty cans of beans, cigarette packs, and dozens of liquor bottles, mostly cheap whiskey and vodka, scattered around like someone had been throwing them after finishing. The smell hit me immediately. Unwashed bodies, rotting food, and something else underneath it all. Something chemical and sharp that made my nose burn. Against a large oak tree, I counted 4 rifles and what looked like 2 shotguns, just propped there casual as you please, along with several boxes of ammunition stacked on a piece of plywood. My first instinct was to back away slowly, get the hell out of there before whoever lived in this mess came back. These weren't homeless folks down on their luck. The firearms alone told me that much. I started taking careful steps backward, trying not to snap any twigs or rustle the undergrowth, when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. About 30 feet to my left, partially hidden behind a thick pine trunk, someone was standing perfectly still, watching me. It was a woman, maybe mid-40s, wearing a stained yellow tank top and cut-off jeans, her hair matted and hanging in greasy strands around her face. She didn't say anything, didn't move, just stared at me with this blank expression that made every hair on my arm stand up. I raised my hand in what I hoped was a friendly wave, tried to smile, and said something like, "Sorry, didn't mean to intrude. Just got turned around looking for the creek." She didn't respond, didn't even blink, and that's when I noticed more movement. To my right, behind me, all around the perimeter of the camp. They were everywhere. I counted at least 8 people, maybe more, all positioned between the trees like they'd been waiting there the whole time. Men and women of various ages, all dressed in worn, dirty clothes, all watching me with that same vacant stare. None of them spoke or made any aggressive moves. They just stood there, strategically placed to block every possible exit route I might take. The closest one to me was a skinny guy, probably early 20s, with a scraggly beard and a faded baseball cap, standing maybe 15 feet away next to a makeshift table made from an old door, balanced on cinder blocks. On that table, I could see plastic bags filled with something white, a digital scale, and what looked like burner phones lined up in a row. The chemical smell I'd noticed earlier suddenly made sense, and I felt my mouth go completely dry. These people weren't just squatting in the forest. They were cooking something out here, and I'd just walked right into the middle of their operation. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We all just stood there in this bizarre standoff while sweat rolled down my spine. Then, from behind one of the larger tents, an older man emerged. He was different from the others. Cleaner, wearing fresh clothes, a gray button-up shirt and dark jeans with actual leather boots instead of the raggedy sneakers everyone else had on. He had silver hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and walked with this confident stride that immediately marked him as the one in charge. He approached me slowly, stopping about 10 feet away, and when he smiled, I noticed he had all his teeth, white and straight, unlike the meth mouth situation I could see on some of the others. "You're pretty far off the trail, friend," he said, his voice calm and oddly pleasant, like we were chatting at a coffee shop instead of in the middle of nowhere with armed guards surrounding us. "GPS must have led you astray. Happens sometimes out here. These devices, they don't always account for the old trails, the ones that aren't on the official maps anymore." I tried to keep my voice steady as I agreed with him, explaining that yeah, I'd been following what I thought was a deer path down to the creek and must have gotten confused. He nodded along, still smiling, and then asked me where I'd parked, how long I'd been hiking, if anyone knew where I was today. The questions seemed casual, but I could feel the weight behind each one. He was trying to figure out if I was alone, if anyone would come looking for me. I lied and said my girlfriend was expecting me back by 5, that she had my GPS coordinates on her phone through one of those safety apps, that she'd already texted me twice asking for updates. His eyes narrowed slightly at that, and he pulled out an old flip phone from his pocket, checking something on it. "No cell service out here," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Haven't been for years. Tower companies don't bother with this section of the forest." My stomach turned to ice because he was right. I hadn't had a signal since about 2 miles from the trailhead, and we both knew it. He took a step closer, and I instinctively stepped back, which made him chuckle. "Relax, nobody here wants trouble. We're just a group of folks who prefer living off the grid, away from all the government oversight and surveillance. You understand that, don't you? Sometimes a man just needs his freedom." Behind him, I could see 2 more people emerging from tents, both carrying what looked like hunting rifles, though they kept them pointed at the ground. One of them, a heavy-set man with a thick red beard and a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, walked over to the table with the drugs and started casually packing things into a black duffel bag, never taking his eyes off me. The leader continued talking, his tone still friendly but with an edge creeping in. "Problem is, friend, you've seen our little community here. That puts us in an awkward position. We value our privacy, you see. Have to, considering how the world treats people like us who just want to be left alone. So now we need to figure out what to do about this situation." The woman in the yellow tank top had moved closer while he was talking, now standing maybe 8 feet away, and I could see her more clearly. Her arms were covered in scabs and scratches, some fresh, some healing, and her pupils were so dilated her eyes looked almost black. She kept scratching at her neck with dirty fingernails, leaving red marks on her skin, and mumbling something under her breath that I couldn't make out. The leader noticed me watching her and sighed. "Don't mind Julie. She's going through a rough patch, but we take care of our own here." He gestured around the camp with obvious pride. "Everyone here has a story, a reason they can't be part of regular society anymore. Some got pushed out, some chose to leave. But we've built something here, a real community. We look out for each other, share what we have, protect what's ours." His hand moved to rest on his hip, pushing back his shirt just enough for me to see the grip of a pistol tucked into his waistband. "And we're very, very good at protecting what's ours. I knew I had to get out of there, but running would be suicide. They knew this terrain. They were armed, and they had me surrounded. So I tried to play it cool, told him I understood completely, that I was just a hiker who took a wrong turn and had no interest in anyone's business. I even made up a story about my own brother getting hassled by the cops for living in an RV, trying to build some kind of connection. The leader listened, tilting his head like he was considering my words, then looked around at his people. Some kind of silent communication passed between them, nods and gestures I couldn't interpret. Finally, he turned back to me and said, "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk with me and my associate here." He pointed to the red-bearded man who'd finished packing the duffel bag. "And we're going to escort you back to the main trail, You're going to forget you ever saw this place. You're going to forget these faces, forget this conversation. Because if you don't, if we see any cops sniffing around here or rangers or anyone asking questions, well..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the red-bearded man made a throat-cutting gesture that was crystal clear. "They made me empty my pockets first, took my phone, my GPS unit, even my little digital camera I had clipped to my pack strap. The leader scrolled through my phone's photos while the red-bearded guy checked my GPS history, making sure I hadn't marked any waypoints near their camp. Clean," the big man grunted, "and they gave everything back except the GPS. That stays with us," the leader said. "Consider it a small price for your education today." Then we started walking, the leader in front, me in the middle, and the red-bearded man behind me with his rifle now cradled in his arms. The rest of the group stayed at the camp, but I could feel their eyes on us until the trees swallowed us up. We walked in silence for about 20 minutes, pushing through thick undergrowth, following no trail I could see. The leader moved through the forest like he'd been doing it his whole life, never hesitating, never checking a compass. Behind me, I could hear the red-bearded man's heavy breathing and the occasional grunt when he had to duck under a low branch. When we finally reached what the leader called the main trail, though it looked like just another barely visible path to me, he stopped and turned to face me. "Your car's that way," he said, pointing north. "About 3 miles. Should take you an hour if you move quick." He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "I want to be very clear about something. We know what you look like now. We know your name from your license in your wallet. We know you're from Little Rock. If anything happens to disturb our peace here, we'll know who to thank for it. And friend, you do not want that. We have people in town, people who can find anyone, anywhere. This forest is our home, and we protect our home with extreme prejudice," the red-bearded man added. "Saw your parking pass too. Nice blue Ford pickup, Arkansas plates ending in 472. Be a shame if something happened to it on one of those dark city streets." The threat was so casual, so matter-of-fact, that it hit harder than if they'd been screaming at me. The leader gave me one last smile, that same unsettling, friendly expression from before, and said, "You seem like a smart man. Smart men know when to keep their mouths shut. Don't make us regret letting you walk away." Then they turned and melted back into the forest, moving so quietly I lost sight of them within seconds, even though I was staring right at where they'd gone. I stood there for a full minute, making sure they were really gone before I started hiking north as fast as I could without actually running. Those 3 miles felt like 30, and I kept looking back, expecting to see them following me. But there was nothing but trees and shadows. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, intact and alone in the small gravel parking area, I nearly cried with relief. I drove straight home, didn't stop for gas or food or anything, just white-knuckled it all the way back to Little Rock. And you know what? I never reported it. Never told the cops, never told the rangers, never even told my family. It's been 4 months now and I still check my rearview mirror constantly. Still get jumpy when I see a blue tarp or smell that chemical smell. I know those people are still out there, cooking their drugs and living their twisted version of freedom. But I also know they were dead serious about their threats. Sometimes keeping quiet isn't about being a coward. It's about being smart enough to know when you're completely outmatched. Last fall, I was 24 and working at an outdoor equipment store in Colorado, spending most weekends exploring trails with my coworkers. We were all pretty experienced hikers, the kind of people who'd rather spend Saturday morning on a mountain than sleeping in. That particular October day started like any other adventure. Me, my coworker Jason, his girlfriend Melissa, and our friend Connor decided to check out a lesser-known trail system about 2 hours from Denver. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air with golden aspens everywhere, and we'd packed enough supplies for a solid 8-mile loop that was supposed to take us through some beautiful backcountry. I remember joking with Connor about how we'd probably only see deer and maybe some wild turkeys. Nothing more exciting than that. We had no idea what we were about to walk into, or how fast a perfect hiking day could turn into something that still makes me check my rearview mirror whenever I drive through wooded areas. About 3 miles into the hike, Jason spotted what looked like an old logging road branching off from the main trail, barely visible through the overgrown brush and fallen leaves. We weren't in any rush, had plenty of daylight left, and Jason was convinced it might lead to an old mine or cabin. Colorado's full of abandoned stuff like that from the mining days. The path was rough, clearly hadn't been used in years. With thick undergrowth scratching at our legs and low-hanging branches we had to duck under every few feet. After maybe 15 minutes of pushing through this mess, we came into a small clearing where the trees opened up just enough to let in patches of sunlight. Right there in the middle, partially hidden by tall grass and surrounded by rusted beer cans and old campfire remains, was this beat-up white van, probably from the early 2000s based on the shape. The thing looked like it had been there for months at least. The tires were deflated, windows were covered in dirt and pine needles, and rust was eating through the wheel wells. But what caught our attention was that the back doors were slightly open, just a few inches, like someone had tried to close them but they wouldn't latch properly. Connor made some joke about finding a serial killer's hideout, and we all laughed nervously, but curiosity got the better of us. Melissa stayed back a few feet while Jason, Connor, and I approached the van, our hiking boots crunching on broken glass and old leaves. The smell hit us before we even got close. This thick, musty combination of mildew, rotting fabric, and something else I couldn't quite place, like metal mixed with something organic. Jason reached the back doors first and used a stick to push them open wider, the hinges screaming like they hadn't moved in forever. What we saw inside made us all take a step back at the same time. The floor of the van was covered in women's belongings, purses, shoes, jewelry, cell phones, all different styles and sizes, like they'd been collected from different people. But that wasn't the worst part. Bolted to the walls were these heavy-duty metal restraints, the kind you'd see in a prison transport vehicle, with thick chains attached. There were dark stains on the floor beneath them that I didn't want to think too hard about. Melissa whispered that we needed to call the police immediately, and she was absolutely right, but none of us had cell service this deep in the woods. Connor was already backing away, saying we should get back to the main trail and find help, when we heard it, the distinct sound of branches breaking somewhere behind us, not like an animal moving through the brush, but deliberate, heavy footsteps. We all went completely still. Even our breathing seemed too loud in that moment. The footsteps were getting closer, coming from the direction we'd hiked in from, cutting off our path back to the main trail. Jason grabbed a large rock, Connor pulled out his pocket knife, and I picked up a thick branch, though I knew none of these would do much good if whoever was coming meant trouble. Melissa had her phone out, recording everything even though we couldn't call anyone, her hands trembling as she held it up. The footsteps stopped maybe 30 feet away, just beyond where we could see through the thick trees and undergrowth. Then we heard whistling, this slow, casual tune like someone taking a leisurely walk, completely out of place in that terrifying moment. A man's voice called out, friendly and warm, "Hey there, folks. Didn't expect to run into anyone out here." "You lost?" The normalcy of his tone made it somehow worse. Jason squeezed my arm and pointed with his eyes to a small deer path leading uphill to our right. If we needed to run, that was our only option. The whistling started again, getting closer, and then he stepped into view. He was probably in his 50s, wearing faded jeans and a flannel shirt, looking like any regular guy you'd pass at a gas station. He had this genuine-looking smile, laugh lines around his eyes, and was carrying a backpack and what looked like a fishing rod. But his boots, I'll never forget this. His boots had fresh mud on them, really fresh, even though it hadn't rained in weeks and the ground here was bone dry. He glanced at the van and his expression shifted for just a second, this flash of something else before the friendly mask came back. "Oh, you found my old project," he said, walking closer, positioning himself between us and both the logging road and the deer path Jason had spotted. Been meaning to haul that piece of junk out of here for years. Bought it at an auction. Thought I'd fix it up for camping, but you know how it goes. His explanation came too quick, too rehearsed, like he'd practiced it. Connor, trying to play along, said something about how we were just exploring and should probably head back. The man's smile widened, but his eyes stayed flat and unblinking. "Where you folks parked? I know these woods like the back of my hand, could show you a shortcut." He set down his fishing rod against a tree, and I noticed his right hand stayed in his jacket pocket, gripping something. Melissa had lowered her phone, but I could see it was still recording. The man noticed it too, his jaw tightening slightly. "That's quite a phone you got there, miss. They work out here?" "Mine never does." The way he said it wasn't really a question. That's when Jason did something brilliant. He suddenly doubled over, groaning and clutching his stomach, saying he thought he was going to be sick from something he ate at breakfast. It was so unexpected that even the man took a step back, his hand coming out of his pocket empty as he moved away from Jason's potential vomit zone. In that split second of distraction, Connor grabbed Melissa's hand and shouted, "Run!" We scattered in different directions. Connor and Melissa took the deer path uphill. Jason bolted straight into the thick woods to the left, and I ran back toward the van, then veered right, crashing through the undergrowth. Behind me, I heard the man curse loudly, his friendly act completely gone, followed by heavy footsteps. He was chasing someone, but I couldn't tell who. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode as I tore through branches that ripped at my clothes and face, jumping over fallen logs, skidding on loose rocks. I could hear shouting behind me, multiple voices now, which meant at least some of my friends were still running too. After what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, I burst out onto what looked like another old logging road, wider than the first one. My legs were shaking and my lungs burned, but I kept moving, jogging now instead of full sprinting. That's when I heard Connor's voice calling my name from somewhere to my left. I followed the sound and found him and Melissa hiding behind a massive fallen tree, both of them scratched up and breathing hard. Melissa was crying but still had her phone clutched in her hand. We waited there, listening for any sound of pursuit, for what must have been 5 minutes before Jason came crashing through the brush from a completely different direction, his shirt torn and blood running down his arm from a deep scratch. He'd lost the man by going through a creek bed and doubling back. We didn't stop to celebrate our reunion. We just started moving, staying together this time, following the logging road which eventually, miraculously, connected to an actual Forest Service road with trail markers. It took us another 2 hours of half running, half speed walking before we finally reached the parking area where Connor's truck was waiting, untouched. The second we had cell service, Melissa called 911 while Connor started the truck, ready to leave immediately if needed. The dispatcher kept us on the line, asking detailed questions about the location, the van, the man's description, everything we could remember. Within 20 minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived at the parking area to take our statements, and they called in more units to search for the van. We showed them the video Melissa had taken. Her phone had captured the interior of the van clearly, including the restraints and the scattered belongings, plus about 10 seconds of the man before she lowered it. One of the deputies, an older woman with graying hair, watched the footage and immediately got on her radio, calling for additional backup and mentioning something about connecting this to the other cases. That phrase made my whole body go cold. She wouldn't tell us what other cases, just said detectives would be in touch and we needed to go to the station to give formal statements. We spent the next 4 hours at the sheriff's station, each in separate rooms, going over every detail again and again with different officers and detectives. They had us look through photo lineups, asking if we recognized anyone, but the man from the woods wasn't in any of them. A detective named Brennan finally told us that 3 women had gone missing from trails in that general area over the past 18 months, all experienced hikers who'd vanished without a trace. The belongings we'd seen in the van matched descriptions of items the missing women had with them. By the time they let us leave, it was past midnight, and they gave us each a business card with a case number, telling us not to discuss the details with anyone except law enforcement while the investigation was active. They also mentioned that they'd found the location we described, but the van was gone. Just tire tracks in the dirt, and some scattered trash remained. The man had moved it sometime during our escape, which meant he'd gone back while we were running, calm enough to drive that van out of there despite knowing we'd seen everything. The investigation went on for months, and Detective Brennan stayed in touch, calling occasionally with follow-up questions or to show us new photos of potential suspects, but nothing ever came of it. They found the van 2 weeks later, burned out in a ravine about 50 miles away, completely destroyed along with any evidence it might have contained. The man we encountered was never identified or caught. Those 3 missing women are still missing. What haunts me most is how normal he seemed at first, how he could have been anybody. A neighbor, someone behind you in line at the grocery store, a friendly hiker sharing the trail. Jason ended up quitting his job and moving to Arizona, said he couldn't handle being around forests anymore. Melissa and Connor broke up a few months later. She told me once that every time she looked at him, she remembered that day, and it was too much. We all dealt with it differently, but none of us ever went hiking together again. I still live in Colorado, still work at the same store, but I haven't been on a trail since that October day. Sometimes customers ask me for recommendations about that particular area, and I always steer them somewhere else, anywhere else. The police asked us not to share specific details about the case publicly, and I've honored that. Changed some minor things here to protect the investigation, but I needed to tell someone the real story. Last month, Detective Brennan called to tell me there had been another disappearance, this time from a trail about 30 miles from where we'd been. Same pattern. Experienced female hiker vanished without a trace. Car found at the trailhead with everything still inside. She asked if I'd be willing to look at some new photos, maybe help with a sketch artist, and I agreed, but I knew it wouldn't matter. That man is still out there, probably with a different van now, maybe in a different state, still whistling that same casual tune while he hunts. If you're reading this and you love hiking like I used to, please just remember, if you ever find something in the woods that shouldn't be there, don't investigate. Don't let curiosity win. Just run. Run and don't stop until you're safe, because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some monsters look just like everyone else. The weekend started like any other hiking trip I'd taken with my college buddies. It was early May 2018, right after finals week at Oregon State, and the 4 of us, me, Brandon, Kevin, and Josh, decided we needed to decompress in the mountains. I was 22 then, working part-time at a sporting goods store while finishing my environmental science degree. We'd booked this rustic cabin near Mount Hood through some sketchy website that Josh found, mainly because it was dirt cheap and had decent reviews. The place sat about 3 miles from the nearest trailhead, surrounded by nothing but Douglas firs and the occasional deer path. We figured it would be perfect for disconnecting from everything. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just us, our backpacks full of beer and trail mix, and whatever card games we remembered to bring. The first day was exactly what we needed. We hiked about 8 miles on the Pacific Crest Trail, took photos at every scenic overlook, and made it back to the cabin around sunset, exhausted but satisfied. The cabin itself was smaller than the photos suggested. Basically 1 main room with 2 bunk beds, a kitchenette that hadn't been updated since the 70s, and a bathroom where you had to jiggle the toilet handle just right to make it stop running. But honestly, after sleeping in tents for most of our camping trips, having 4 walls and a roof felt like luxury. We cooked burgers on the ancient propane stove, played poker using pretzel sticks as chips, and Brandon told the same story about his ex-girlfriend that he'd been telling since freshman year. By 11 o'clock, we were all ready to crash, our legs sore from the hike, and our stomachs full of cheap beer and junk food. Around midnight, I woke up needing to pee. Probably shouldn't have had that fourth beer. The cabin was pitch black except for the green glow from Josh's fitness watch on the nightstand. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, trying not to wake anyone as I navigated between the backpacks and hiking boots scattered across the floor. That's when I heard it. Heavy footsteps on the wooden deck outside. Not the light patter of a raccoon or the quick movements of a deer, but deliberate, measured steps, like someone walking slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. I stood there in my boxers, phone in hand, listening as the footsteps moved from the front deck toward the side where our bedroom window was. They'd take 3 or 4 steps, then stop for maybe 10 seconds, then continue. The boards creaked under the weight. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. Kevin must have heard it too because I saw him sit up in the bottom bunk across from me. We made eye contact in the dim light, and he mouthed, "What the hell?" I shrugged, but my chest was already tightening with that primal feeling you get when something's genuinely wrong. The footsteps continued their circuit around the cabin, pausing at each window. I crept over to the front window and carefully moved the curtain aside just an inch. In the moonlight, I could make out a figure, tall, wearing what looked like a dark jacket and jeans, standing about 10 feet from the cabin, just staring at the building. He wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything really, just standing there with his arms at his sides. After maybe 30 seconds, he turned and walked toward the tree line, disappearing into the shadows between the massive fir trees. We woke Brandon and Josh, whispering about what we'd seen. Josh, always the skeptic, insisted it was probably just another hiker who got lost, or maybe the property owner checking on the cabin. But Brandon pointed out what we were all thinking. Who the hell checks on a rental cabin at midnight by walking circles around it and staring through windows? We decided to barricade the door with the heavy wooden dresser, which made an awful scraping sound against the floor that seemed to echo in the silence. Josh grabbed the cast iron skillet from the kitchen. Kevin found a hiking pole, and Brandon clutched his pocket knife like it was a sword. I had my phone ready to call 911, even though we all knew there was no signal. We sat there in the dark, 4 grown men huddled together like kids at a sleepover, listening to every sound outside, every branch that moved in the wind, every pine cone that fell on the roof. For about an hour, nothing happened. We started to relax a little, making nervous jokes about how we'd tell this story later, how we'd probably scared ourselves over some drunk local or a confused park ranger. Josh even suggested we were being paranoid and should move the dresser back. Then the doorknob turned. Not a violent twist, but slow and deliberate, like someone testing if it was locked. The handle jiggled once, twice, then stopped. We heard footsteps on the deck again, heavier this time, less careful. They walked to the window on the left side of the door, the one we hadn't covered with curtains because it faced the woods. A face appeared in the glass, hands cupped around the eyes to see inside better. The guy was probably in his 40s, with a scraggly beard and a baseball cap pulled low. He pressed his forehead against the window, scanning the dark room, and even though we were all frozen in place, I swear he was looking right at us. The man disappeared from the window and everything went quiet for maybe 5 minutes. We could hear our own breathing, Brandon's knuckles cracking as he gripped his knife tighter, the old refrigerator humming in the corner. Then came a sound that made my whole body go rigid, the screech of metal on metal from the back of the cabin. Kevin whispered that there was a tool shed attached to the rear wall, and the owner had mentioned something about maintenance equipment being stored there. We heard rustling, things being moved around, and then footsteps returning to the front of the cabin. This time, he didn't test the doorknob. Instead, we heard a solid thunk against the door, then another. He was using something heavy, maybe a crowbar or a hammer, working at the lock. The old wooden door frame started splintering with each hit, little pieces of painted wood falling onto the floor inside. Josh didn't wait for the door to give way. He started yelling at the top of his lungs, "We've called the police, they're on their way, get the hell out of here!" Which was a complete lie, but seemed worth trying. The pounding stopped for a second, and we heard the man's voice for the first time, rough and slurred like he'd been drinking. "Ain't no police coming out here, boys. Just want to talk. Open up." The way he said boys made my skin prickle. He'd been watching us long enough to know we were young men. Not a family, not a couple. Brandon started recording a video on his phone, thinking maybe we'd need evidence later, while Kevin grabbed the fire extinguisher from beside the stove. The pounding resumed, harder now, and we could see the door frame starting to buckle. The deadbolt was holding, but the wood around it was cracking, splitting along the grain with each impact. When the door finally gave way, it happened fast. The frame splintered completely and the door swung inward, slamming against the dresser we'd pushed in front of it. The dresser held, but there was now a gap of about 8 inches between the door and the frame. The man's arm reached through, trying to push the dresser aside, his dirty fingers grasping at air. Kevin didn't hesitate. He aimed the fire extinguisher at the gap and let loose, filling the doorway with white chemical foam. The man yanked his arm back, coughing and cursing, stumbling backward on the deck. That gave us maybe 10 seconds. Josh and I threw our weight against the dresser, trying to push it back against the broken door, while Brandon grabbed his backpack and started pulling out anything we could use. A camping hatchet he'd brought for splitting kindling, a length of rope, even a can of bear spray he'd insisted on packing despite everyone making fun of him for it. The man came back angrier, wiping foam from his face with his sleeve. He kicked at the door, sending the dresser sliding back another few inches despite our weight against it. Through the gap, I could see him clearly now. Weathered face, wild eyes, wearing a flannel shirt with reflective strips like construction workers wear. He wedged the crowbar into the gap and started prying, using his whole body weight as leverage. The dresser scraped across the floor inch by inch. Kevin sprayed him again with the extinguisher, but it was running low, producing more of a weak mist than a strong blast. That's when Brandon made his move. He lunged forward with the bear spray, stuck his hand through the gap, and emptied the entire can directly into the man's face. The scream that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard, primal and enraged. The man fell backward off the deck, clutching his face, rolling on the ground. We used those moments to reinforce our barricade. Josh and I flipped the kitchen table and wedged it against the dresser, while Kevin grabbed the bunk bed mattresses to stack against the windows. Brandon stood guard at the door gap with the hatchet, ready to swing if the man tried to reach through again. We could hear him outside, still moaning, stumbling around, knocking things over. Then we heard something that gave us hope. Sirens in the distance. Turns out Josh's phone had managed to send an emergency SOS when he'd tried calling 911 earlier. Even without cell service, some phones can still ping emergency satellites, and apparently his had gotten through. The sirens grew louder, and we saw red and blue lights filtering through the trees. The man must have heard them too, because we heard him crash through the underbrush, heading deeper into the woods. By the time 2 sheriff's deputies arrived, weapons drawn and flashlights sweeping the area, he was gone. The deputies took our statements, examined the damaged door, and called for backup to search the woods. One of them, Deputy Ramirez, recognized our description of the man immediately. His name was Carl Dietrich, a local who'd been fired from his job at a logging company 3 months earlier. Since then, he'd been living rough in the forest, and there had been several reports of him watching hikers from the trees, following people on trails, and breaking into empty cabins. They'd been looking for him for weeks. They found him about 2 hours later, hiding in a drainage pipe about a mile away, still partially blind from the bear spray. We spent the rest of the night giving statements at the sheriff's station, drinking terrible coffee from paper cups. They told us Carl had a history of mental illness and substance abuse, and losing his job had sent him into a spiral. He'd been stalking hiking groups for weeks, but we were the first ones he'd actually tried to confront. The detective said we did everything right, stayed together, fought back, and most importantly, didn't let him inside where he could have cornered us. We drove home that morning in complete silence, everyone processing what had happened. I haven't been camping since. I need to get this out there because the park rangers, the police, Nobody wants to talk about what happened to my brother Nathan last September. I'm a high school biology teacher in Montana. Been teaching for about 7 years now. And I've always been the rational one in my family. Nathan was 29, worked as a physical therapist at a clinic downtown, and had this thing about hiking solo every weekend to decompress from dealing with patients all week. He'd been doing these solo hikes for maybe 3 years, always sending me photos from whatever trail he was on, usually terrible selfies with his goofy grin and whatever wildlife he spotted in the background. That Saturday in September started like any other weekend for him, except this time he chose Glacier National Park, specifically the Highline Trail because he'd heard the mountain goats were really active that time of year. The last text I got from Nathan was at 8:47 a.m., just a photo of the trailhead sign with the caption, "Starting out, should be back by 4. He was wearing his bright orange jacket, the one our mom bought him specifically so he'd be visible to hunters, even though hunting wasn't allowed in the park. I remember joking with him the night before about how he looked like a traffic cone in that thing, and he laughed saying at least the search and rescue team would spot him easily if he twisted an ankle. The trail he picked was one of the most popular in the park, especially on a Saturday morning in early fall, when the weather was perfect, about 65 degrees with clear skies. There must have been at least 40 other hikers who started that same trail within an hour of Nathan, based on what the rangers told us later. The parking lot was nearly full when he arrived, and several people remembered seeing him because of that orange jacket, stretching by his blue Toyota pickup, adjusting his backpack straps, doing his usual pre-hike routine. Around 2 p.m. I got a weird feeling in my chest, like when you're taking a test and suddenly realize you studied the wrong chapter. I tried calling Nathan just to check in, which wasn't something I normally did during his hikes, but the call went straight to voicemail. I figured he was in a dead zone, happens all the time in the mountains, so I left a stupid message about remembering to bring me one of those Huckleberry energy bars from the gift shop. By 5 p.m., when he hadn't texted that he was back at his truck, I started getting concerned. Nathan was obsessive about letting me know when he finished a hike, ever since that time 3 years ago when he forgot to check in and our mom called the rangers. By 6 p.m., I was calling the park service myself, trying not to sound like an overreacting family member, explaining that my brother was experienced but always checked in, and this wasn't like him at all. The initial search started that evening, just a couple of rangers driving the road and checking the parking areas. Nathan's truck was still there, locked, with his wallet tucked under the passenger seat where he always left it. They figured maybe he'd twisted an ankle and was slowly making his way back. Happens more often than you'd think. But then this couple, the Andersons from Wisconsin, came forward with something that made everyone pause. They'd been hiking back around 1:30 p.m. and saw Nathan about 3 miles in, standing beside the trail next to a massive Douglas fir tree. Mrs. Anderson remembered specifically because Nathan had helped them take a photo at a scenic overlook about 10 minutes earlier, and she'd commented on his jacket, saying her grandson had the same one. When they passed him by that tree, he was just standing there, his backpack on the ground beside him, looking up into the branches like he was watching something. Mr. Anderson had asked if everything was okay, and Nathan had turned, given them this huge smile, and said, "Just perfect, actually. Have a great hike." They thought it was weird that he was stopped in such a random spot, not a viewpoint or anything special, just a regular stretch of trail, but figured maybe he'd seen a bird or something. The full search began at dawn on Sunday with 20 volunteers, 3 dog teams, and a helicopter. I drove through the night from Montana to join them, running on gas station coffee and pure adrenaline. The search coordinator, a woman named Ranger Fielding who'd been doing this for 15 years, walked me through their grid pattern, showed me on the topographic map where the Andersons had seen Nathan. She kept reassuring me that most missing hikers are found within the first 48 hours, usually dehydrated, but fine. The dogs picked up Nathan's scent immediately from his truck and followed it precisely to that exact spot by the Douglas fir, 3 miles in. Then nothing. Not a single trace beyond that tree. The lead dog handler, this gruff guy named Tom who barely spoke except to his German shepherd, walked that same circle around the tree maybe 50 times, watching his dog's reaction. The dog would track right up to where the backpack was found, sit down and whine, pawing at the ground like the scent just evaporated into thin air. What they found at that spot still makes my skin prickle whenever I think about it. Nathan's backpack was placed, not dropped, but carefully placed against the base of the tree, standing upright with all the zippers closed. His phone was in the side pocket, still on, battery at 47%, with perfect signal. 4 bars. His water bottles were full, his lunch untouched, his emergency whistle still clipped to the shoulder strap. But here's the detail that nobody can explain. His hiking boots were inside the backpack. Not worn out, not damaged, just neatly placed inside with the socks tucked into them, like he'd carefully taken them off and packed them away. The ground around the tree was soft from recent rain 2 days before, should have shown clear footprints. But there was nothing. No barefoot prints, no sign of anyone walking away from that spot. No disturbed vegetation, no broken branches. Rangers brought in tracking experts who could follow a week-old deer trail through solid rock, but they all came to the same conclusion. It was like Nathan just stopped existing at that exact spot. I stayed for 2 weeks, sleeping in my car at the trailhead parking lot because I couldn't leave. Every morning I'd hike to that tree, sometimes with search teams, sometimes alone, just staring at the spot, trying to understand. Other hikers would pass by, completely unaware they were walking through what had become a crime scene, though there was no crime anyone could identify. I started talking to everyone who'd been on the trail that day, became obsessed with finding someone, anyone who'd seen something after the Andersons. That's when I met Gregory Watts, a retired Forest Service employee who'd been hiking that same trail for 30 years. He hadn't seen Nathan, but when I described the exact location, his face went pale. He told me that in 1987, a woman named Carol Dunham had gone missing from that exact same spot. Same circumstances, backpack found neat and tidy, shoes inside, no tracks leading away. They never found her either. He said the old-timers who worked the park back then called it a quiet spot, wouldn't elaborate on what that meant, just said sometimes the forest chooses to keep someone. The investigation went on for months, but the official search was called off after 3 weeks. They brought in cadaver dogs, thermal drones, even some professor from the university with ground-penetrating radar. Nothing. Nathan's phone records showed no calls after my attempt at 2 p.m., but here's something that still bothers me. His phone's GPS showed him at that tree from 1:28 p.m. until 1:31 p.m. Then the location services just stopped updating. Not turned off, not lost signal, just stopped recording data while the phone stayed on. The FBI got involved briefly because of the bizarre circumstances, ran all these background checks thinking maybe Nathan had staged his own disappearance. But his bank accounts were untouched. His apartment was exactly as he'd left it, with dishes in the sink and laundry in the dryer. His passport was still in his desk drawer. The agent assigned to the case, Agent Coleman, told me off the record that in 40 years of missing persons cases, she'd never seen anything like it. She said usually there's something, a mistake, a clue, some tiny detail that doesn't fit. But with Nathan, everything was perfectly wrong in a way that made no logical sense. 4 months after Nathan disappeared, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a woman named Janet Holloway, who said she'd been following Nathan's case online and needed to talk to me. She drove 8 hours from Idaho to meet me at a diner near the park. Janet's daughter Rebecca had vanished on a popular trail in Yellowstone in 2016, same exact scenario. Backpack found perfectly arranged, shoes inside, phone still powered on, no tracks. But Janet had something else, something the authorities had dismissed. 3 days before Rebecca disappeared, she'd called her mother, excited about meeting another hiker who'd told her about thin places in the wilderness, spots where experienced hikers sometimes felt an overwhelming urge to stop and just step through. Rebecca had laughed it off as new age nonsense, but she'd mentioned the hiker had specifically warned her to never take her shoes off if she felt that urge, that it was like an invitation. Janet had 23 cases she'd compiled over the past 5 years, all with the same pattern, all in different parks across the country. Every single one had their shoes removed and carefully stored. The part that haunts me most came from Nathan's co-worker, Bradley, who called me about 6 months later. He'd been cleaning out Nathan's desk at the clinic and found a notebook Nathan used for patient notes. But the last 3 pages weren't about patients. Starting 2 weeks before his hike, Nathan had been writing about these vivid dreams, where he was walking through a forest that looked exactly like the trails he hiked, except everything was slightly shifted. Trees growing at impossible angles, paths that curved upward into the air, and this persistent feeling that someone was walking beside him, matching his steps perfectly but always just outside his peripheral vision. In the last entry, dated the night before his hike, he wrote, "The footsteps are getting louder. They sound exactly like mine but delayed by half a second. Starting to think they're not following me. Starting to think they're waiting for me to catch up." Bradley thought Nathan might have been having some kind of breakdown, but I knew my brother. He was the most grounded, rational person I'd ever known. He would have told me if something was wrong. At least I thought he would have. Last month, almost a year after Nathan vanished, I went back to the trail one final time. I needed closure, even if it meant accepting I'd never understand what happened. I stood at that Douglas fir for hours, running my hands over the bark, sitting where his backpack had been found. Around noon, just as I was about to leave, I noticed something carved into the tree, about 7 feet up, partially hidden by new growth. It looked old, maybe decades old, but I could make out initials. CD. 1987, Carol Dunham. Above it, fresher but still weathered, RH 2016, Rebecca Holloway. My heart was pounding as I looked higher, and there it was, so fresh the sap was still sticky. NP 2024, Nathan Pierce. But Nathan never carved his initials into trees. He was obsessive about leaving no trace when hiking. I took photos, called the rangers immediately, but when they arrived 2 hours later with a forensics team, the carvings were gone. Not removed, not covered up, just gone like they'd never existed. The bark was smooth and untouched. They looked at me like I was having a breakdown, suggested grief counseling, but I know what I saw. I don't hike anymore. Can't bring myself to step onto any trail, no matter how popular or safe it seems. Sometimes I dream about Nathan, and he's always standing by that tree, his orange jacket bright against the green forest, waving at me like he's saying hello or goodbye. I can never tell which. The Andersons, that couple from Wisconsin, they reached out to me recently. Mrs. Anderson couldn't stop thinking about that smile Nathan gave them. Said it didn't seem like his usual expression from earlier when he'd helped with their photo. She said it looked like the smile of someone who'd just figured out the answer to a question they'd been asking their whole life. The investigation is officially still open, but I know they'll never find him. I think Gregory Watts was right about the forest choosing to keep someone, though I'll never understand why it chose Nathan. All I have left are his things, that orange jacket hanging in my closet, and the knowledge that somewhere, in some way I can't comprehend, my brother found whatever he was looking for on that trail. I just wish I knew if he meant to find it. The search dogs went absolutely insane when they reached that spot. Barking, whining, spinning in circles like they'd hit an invisible wall. And then nothing. Complete silence. 6 different K9 units, all trained in wilderness tracking, and every single one of them lost Ashley Carpenter's scent at the exact same patch of dirt, 40 feet from where we found her water bottle standing perfectly upright against a moss-covered log. I've been volunteering with search and rescue for 8 years now, seen dozens of missing hiker cases, but I've never witnessed anything like what happened in those woods last week. Ashley was my roommate's younger sister, 24 years old, fresh out of nursing school with a job lined up at Harborview Medical Center. She texted her mom a photo from the summit at 11:47 a.m. Big smile, peace sign, her distinctive red hiking boots visible at the bottom of the frame, and by 2 p.m. she'd vanished from a trail she'd hiked at least a dozen times before. The Cascade foothills in early August are packed with hikers, especially on weekends, and the Granite Lake Loop Ashley chose that Saturday morning is basically a highway of outdoor enthusiasts. 5 miles total, moderate difficulty, with wooden bridges over the creeks and signs at every junction telling you exactly how far to the parking lot. When Ashley didn't show up for her 7 p.m. shift at the hospital, her supervisor immediately called her emergency contact. Her car, a beat-up Subaru with nursing textbooks still visible in the back seat, was sitting right there in the trailhead parking lot where she'd left it. Her hiking permit was filled out correctly, displayed on the dashboard, listing her expected return time as 4 p.m. The first search teams deployed within 2 hours of the missed shift call, and I joined them the next morning, thinking we'd find her with a twisted ankle somewhere just off the trail, embarrassed but safe. Day 2 changed everything. Around 11 a.m., Frank, a veteran search volunteer with silver hair and knees that clicked when he walked, spotted something blue about 300 yards off the main trail, down a steep embankment covered in devil's club and blackberry thorns. Ashley's water bottle, that expensive insulated kind everyone in Seattle seems to own, was standing perfectly upright against a decomposing log, not a scratch on it, the ice inside still partially frozen after 36 hours in the woods. Her initials, AMC, were etched into the bottom with what looked like a wood-burning tool, and there was still about half the water left inside. The placement bothered everyone immediately. You don't carefully set your water bottle down if you're injured or panicking, and you definitely don't leave it behind on purpose. 20 feet away, tangled in the low branches of a hemlock tree like someone had thrown it, we found her purple Columbia rain jacket, the lightweight kind that folds into its own pocket. That's when they brought in the dogs, 6 different teams from 3 counties, including this legendary bloodhound named Duke, who'd found a lost kid in a snowstorm 2 winters ago. The handlers started them at Ashley's car, let them get the scent from her sleeping bag she always kept in the trunk, and watched them work their way up the trail. Every single dog followed the exact same path, main trail to the 2-mile marker, sharp left onto a deer track barely visible through the ferns, straight down to where we'd found her gear. But here's where it gets genuinely disturbing. At a seemingly random spot about 40 feet from her water bottle, every dog just stopped. Not gradually losing the scent like what happens when rain washes it away or too many people contaminate the area. They hit that spot and reacted like they'd walked into a wall, some backing up, others sitting down and refusing to move forward. Duke actually started howling in this deep, mournful way that made everyone stop talking. The search coordinator, a woman named Diane who'd been doing this for 15 years, had us form a grid pattern from that spot where the dog stopped. We were literally shoulder to shoulder, moving through the underbrush inch by inch, checking every hollow log, every depression in the ground, every thick cluster of salal bushes. The terrain there was strange. Not quite a clearing, but not dense forest either, with these odd gaps between the trees where the canopy opened up in almost perfect circles. The ground was covered in this thick, spongy moss that made it hard to see if it had been disturbed, and underneath, the soil was dark and loamy, almost black. We found animal tracks, deer, raccoons, what looked like coyote, but no human footprints beyond that mysterious stopping point. The forensics team took soil samples, photographed everything, even brought in ground-penetrating radar, but the equipment kept malfunctioning, showing these weird readings that the operator said he'd never seen before, like the density of the earth kept changing every few feet. I need to tell you about Wednesday afternoon, because that's when things went from strange to genuinely frightening. We'd expanded the search radius to almost 2 miles from where her gear was found, and I was paired with this retired firefighter named George, who kept talking about how the birds were too quiet. He was right. Usually those woods are full of stellar jays and chickadees, but that day, it was like someone had hit a mute button on nature. We were checking this ravine that ran parallel to the trail when George grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises. About 50 feet below us, partially hidden by a massive root ball from a fallen cedar, there was what looked like fresh digging, not natural erosion or animal activity, deliberate human-sized excavation with the dirt piled neatly to one side. We called it in immediately, and within minutes the entire search team had converged on our location. They brought in an excavation team, approached it like a crime scene, everybody holding their breath while they carefully removed the soil. The hole was empty, but it wasn't just empty. It was precisely dug, about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet deep, with corners so sharp they looked machine-cut. The walls were smooth, compacted, like someone had spent hours perfecting them. At the bottom, pressed into the dirt, was a pattern of small indentations that the forensics photographer spent 20 minutes documenting from every angle. They looked almost like writing or symbols, but not quite. More like someone had pressed objects into the soil in a deliberate sequence. The smell coming from that hole was wrong too. Not decay or earth, but something chemical, like copper pennies mixed with antifreeze. While the forensics team worked, I noticed something else. Ashley's phone. It was tucked into a crevice in the root ball, screen cracked but still functional, battery at 12%. The last photo in her gallery wasn't the summit selfie she'd sent her mom. There were 17 more pictures after that, all taken between 1:47 and 1:53 p.m., and every single one was completely black. Diane had me look through the phone with her since I knew Ashley personally, hoping I might notice something important. The black photos had location data intact, all taken within a 100-foot radius of where we found the hole, but at different elevations, like she'd been moving up and down rapidly. Her last text conversation was with someone named Paul, a number not in her contacts from 3 days before her hike. The messages made no sense. Paul had sent her GPS coordinates, nothing else, and Ashley had responded with, "Confirmed for Saturday." When we checked, those coordinates led to a spot about a quarter mile from where the dogs lost her scent. The detective who'd joined the search by then ran Paul's number. It belonged to a burner phone purchased with cash at a gas station in Tacoma 2 weeks earlier, activated once to text Ashley, then never used again. The security footage from the gas station showed a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses, average height, average build, could have been anybody. He paid for the phone and a cup of coffee, kept his head down the entire time. Friday morning, day 6 of the search, brought the most disturbing discovery yet. A hiker not connected to our search party, some tourist from Ohio, had gotten lost and ended up in a section of woods we hadn't covered yet, about 3 miles from Ashley's last known location. He stumbled into the ranger station at Snoqualmie Pass, hyperventilating, saying he'd found what looked like a campsite, but wrong, all wrong. The rangers thought he was dehydrated and hallucinating until he showed them the photos on his phone. Hidden in a cluster of old-growth trees, someone had built what I can only describe as a blind, like what hunters use, but more elaborate. Tarps painted to match the forest colors, netting covered in real branches and moss, positioned to overlook 3 different trail junctions. Inside were maps of the entire trail system, with dates written next to certain locations. Ashley's name wasn't there, but there were 12 other names, all women between 20 and 30, with dates going back 2 years. Some names I recognized from missing person cases that had been ruled as accidents or voluntary disappearances. The investigation exploded after that discovery. FBI arrived within hours. The entire mountain was closed to the public, and they brought in specialized teams I'd never seen before, people in unmarked vans with equipment that looked military grade. They found more blinds, 7 total, all with similar setups and documentation. In one, they discovered notebooks filled with observations, hiking patterns, peak times for trail usage, detailed physical descriptions of regular hikers, their routines, when they hiked alone versus with groups. Ashley's name appeared in the most recent entries, along with notes about her Saturday hiking habit, her favorite trails, even mentions of her red hiking boots, and the fact that she always parked in the same spot. The handwriting analysis showed at least 3 different people had contributed to these notebooks over the years. They also found industrial-grade zip ties, lengths of rope pre-cut to specific measurements, and bottles of that same chemical smell we'd noticed at the hole, which turned out to be a veterinary anesthetic that can be absorbed through the skin. Here's what haunts me most about this whole thing. They never found Ashley, but they found the others. On day 8, cadaver dogs led teams to a section of forest about 5 miles from any official trail, an area so dense with undergrowth that you'd need machetes to get through. There was a natural depression in the land, hidden by a thick canopy and surrounded by devil's clubs so thick it formed an almost impenetrable barrier. Inside that depression, they found remains matching 8 of the 12 names from the notebooks in various stages of decomposition. The forensic anthropologist said the oldest had been there approximately 18 months, the newest maybe 3 weeks. But Ashley wasn't among them. The FBI questioned everyone who'd been on those trails in the past month, pulled surveillance from every gas station and business within 50 miles, analyzed thousands of hours of dashcam footage from the area. They arrested 2 men whose DNA was found on items in the blinds. Both had records for minor crimes. Both claimed they'd been hired through encrypted messages to maintain the sites and document hikers, paid in cryptocurrency, never meeting their employers in person. The official search for Ashley was suspended after 2 weeks, though the criminal investigation continues. The men they arrested insist they never hurt anyone, that they were just paid to watch and report, that someone else, someone they never met, handled what they called the collections. They led investigators to drop sites where they'd leave their notebooks and receive payment, always remote locations with no cameras, always at night. Both men are facing conspiracy charges, but without bodies or direct evidence of violence, the prosecutors are struggling. Ashley's family hired private investigators who are still searching, following up on reported sightings that never pan out. Sometimes I drive up to those trails, now permanently closed, and stand at the fence they've erected. I think about how Ashley's scent just stopped, how those 17 black photos might have been her trying to document something in darkness, how someone watched her for weeks, knew her routines, planned everything meticulously. The worst part is knowing that whoever orchestrated this is still out there, probably already scouting new locations, watching new trails, picking new names to write in notebooks. And Ashley, whether she escaped, was taken, or met some other fate, remains as absent as her scent beyond that mysterious spot where even trained dogs couldn't follow. Teaching art to elementary school kids in a small Pennsylvania college town wasn't exactly thrilling at 27, but it paid the bills. Every day felt like a copy of the last one. Show up at 8, demonstrate how to mix tempera paints, help tiny hands cut construction paper, clean glue off desks, go home to my studio apartment, watch Netflix, sleep, rinse and repeat 5 days a week. The weekends were different though. For about 2 years, I'd been hiking solo every chance I got, driving out to different trails within a couple hours of town. No lesson plans, no sticky fingers grabbing at my sleeves, no parent emails about why their kid got paint on their uniform. Just me and miles of dirt paths winding through the trees. That Saturday in early April, I'd set my alarm for 5:30 to hit Pine Creek Gorge, this massive canyon about an hour north that locals call the Pennsylvania Grand Canyon. The northern trailhead parking lot only had 2 other cars when I pulled in around 7 that morning, which meant I'd have the trail mostly to myself. Perfect hiking weather too, about 50 degrees, clear sky, everything still damp from overnight rain that made the whole forest smell alive and earthy. My pack had all the usual gear: 3 liters of water, homemade granola bars, basic first aid supplies, pepper spray on my hip, phone with a portable charger. The plan was to do this 12-mile loop I'd hiked probably 15 times before, be back at my car by 3, then grab a beer and burger at this place in town that did trivia nights. About 3 miles in, right when the trail starts climbing toward the ridge overlook, I caught this thin column of smoke rising through the trees maybe 200 yards to my left. Not forest fire smoke, too contained for that. More like a campfire, except there weren't any campsites in that section. The smell hit me next, this weird mix of burning herbs and something sharp, almost chemical. Should have ignored it, kept moving, but I started thinking maybe some inexperienced hikers were lost or in trouble. Pushing through the underbrush wasn't easy. Lots of thorny bushes and low branches that kept snagging my pack. The ground was muddy and covered with last fall's leaves, making every step slippery. As I got closer, I could hear voices, low and rhythmic, almost like chanting, but not quite. Through the trees, I finally saw them. 5 men sitting in a rough circle around a small fire. They all looked to be in their 40s or 50s, wearing regular hiking clothes, but somehow seeming completely out of place. Each one had a piece of wood in their hands, maybe 8 inches long and thick as a broom handle, and they were using pocket knives to carve something into them. The way they moved was synchronized, like they'd practiced this exact thing 100 times before. Their voices overlapped in this monotone mumbling that didn't sound like English or Spanish or any language I recognized. The one facing my direction had this shaved head with a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon above his left ear. And he was the first to notice me. His eyes locked onto mine instantly. Pale gray eyes that didn't blink, didn't show surprise, didn't show anything really. He kept carving while staring right at me, and one by one, the others turned their heads to look too. Nobody said hello. Nobody asked if I was lost. Nobody acted like normal people would when a stranger stumbles onto their campsite. The man directly across from the bald one had this thick red beard with gray streaks, and was wearing a faded green jacket with duct tape patches on the elbows. To his left sat a younger guy, maybe 30, with acne scars covering his cheeks, and a weird tattoo of what looked like tree roots climbing up his neck. They all just kept carving and staring, and I realized the symbols they were cutting into the wood weren't random. They were deliberate patterns, almost like letters, but not from any alphabet I knew. "Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt," I managed to say, taking a step backward. My voice came out higher than normal, and I could feel sweat forming on my palms despite the cool morning. The bald one with the birthmark tilted his head slightly, like a dog hearing a strange noise, but didn't respond. Instead, he lifted the piece of wood he'd been carving and held it up toward me. The symbols he'd cut were deep and precise. 3 interlocking triangles with a spiral in the center, and below that, something that looked like a stick figure but with too many arms. The smoke from their fire kept drifting toward me, making my eyes water, and that sweet metallic smell was getting stronger. I noticed they had a metal bucket next to the fire with some kind of liquid in it, dark and oily, and every few seconds one of them would dip their carved stick into it. The 4th man, who I hadn't gotten a good look at before, stood up slowly. He was massive, probably 6'4", wearing a brown canvas jacket that looked like it hadn't been washed in months. His hair was long and greasy, tied back with what appeared to be a shoelace, and he had these deep-set eyes that were so dark they looked black. He didn't walk toward me exactly, just took a few steps to the side, and that's when I realized the 5th man had also stood up and moved in the opposite direction. They were spreading out, not aggressively, but deliberately, like they were trying to form a wider circle. The younger one with the neck tattoo started humming, this low, droning sound that the others picked up one by one until all 5 were doing it. My brain was screaming at me to run, but I tried to play it cool, gave them an awkward wave, and said something stupid like, "Well, have a good hike," before turning around and walking back toward the undergrowth, forcing myself not to run because somehow that felt important. Getting back through the bushes seemed to take forever, every snapping twig under my feet sounding like a gunshot. Once I hit the main trail, I picked up my pace, not quite jogging but definitely speed walking. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and I kept glancing back every few seconds. Nothing, just trees and empty trail. After about 5 minutes, I finally let myself breathe normally and even laughed a little at how paranoid I was being. They were just weird guys doing some strange ritual thing, probably some New Age nature worship group or something. But then I heard it, a branch breaking somewhere behind me, maybe 50 yards back. Then another. The sounds were spaced out, deliberate, like someone trying to maintain distance but definitely following. I pulled out my phone to call 911 but had no signal, which wasn't unusual for that part of the gorge, but felt particularly awful right then. I knew the trail well enough to know there was a park ranger station about 2 miles ahead, right where the loop trail intersects with the Blue Blaze trail that goes down to the creek. 2 miles. I could do 2 miles. I started actually jogging now, not caring if they knew I was scared. The footsteps behind me picked up too, and then I heard that humming again, but louder, coming from multiple directions. They weren't all behind me anymore. Some had gone around through the woods and were moving parallel to the trail. I could catch glimpses of movement through the trees, a flash of that green jacket here, the tall one's brown canvas there. They were keeping pace with me easily, and I realized they knew these woods way better than I did. The worst part was when the humming would stop for a few seconds, and all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and their footsteps getting closer, spreading out wider, like they were hurting me somewhere specific. My legs were burning, and my pack kept bouncing against my back, throwing off my balance. Up ahead I saw a fallen tree blocking part of the trail. Huge thing. Probably came down in a storm, with its root system torn up and creating this wall of dirt and tangled roots about 8 feet high. I had to slow down to climb over it, and that's when the bald one appeared on the trail behind me, maybe 30 feet back. He wasn't running, just walking with this steady, measured pace, still carrying that carved stick. His gray eyes never left mine as I scrambled over the tree, my hiking boots slipping on the wet bark, my knee slamming hard into a branch. Behind him, I could see the younger one with the neck tattoo emerging from the trees, and he had something in his hand. Looked like a rope or cord made from stripped bark, twisted and braided together. The ranger station had to be close, maybe another half mile. I dropped down the other side of the fallen tree and immediately felt a sharp pain in my ankle. Must have landed wrong. But adrenaline is one hell of a drug, and I kept moving, limping but still faster than walking. The trail curved ahead, and I remembered there was a steep section with wooden steps built into the hillside. If I could get there first, maybe I could gain some distance. But when I rounded the curve, the tall one in the brown jacket was standing at the bottom of the steps, just waiting. He had positioned himself perfectly. I couldn't go forward without going through him, and I could hear the others closing in behind me. To my right was a steep drop-off into a ravine, probably 40 feet down to a rocky creek bed. To my left, thick undergrowth and thorns. The humming had stopped completely now, replaced by this horrible silence where I could hear my own pulse thundering in my neck. That's when I remembered the pepper spray on my belt. My fingers were shaking so bad I almost dropped it, but I managed to flip the safety tab off and held it out in front of me, switching my aim between the tall one ahead and checking behind me. The bald one had stopped about 20 feet back, and the others were spread out in a semicircle, all holding those carved sticks like they were precious. The tall one took a step forward, and I just started spraying wildly, screaming at the top of my lungs. Not words, just this primal sound I didn't know I could make. The spray caught him right in the face, and he stumbled backward, hands going to his eyes, making this awful choking sound. I didn't wait to see what the others would do. I charged right at him while he was blinded, shoulder-checked him hard as I passed, and took those wooden steps 3 at a time, my twisted ankles screaming with every impact. Behind me, I could hear shouting for the first time. Actual words, though I couldn't make them out over my own gasping breaths and the blood rushing in my ears. The ranger station came into view, a small brown building with a green roof, and I've never been so happy to see a government building in my life. I burst through the door like a madwoman, probably looked absolutely insane, covered in mud, bleeding from scratches I didn't remember getting, tears and snot all over my face, still clutching that pepper spray like a lifeline. The ranger, this older woman named Officer Garrett, took one look at me and immediately got on her radio. Within 15 minutes, there were 3 more rangers and 2 state police officers there. They searched for over 2 hours but never found the men. They did find the spot where the fire had been. The ashes were still warm, and there were those wood shavings everywhere, covered in symbols. The police took photos and samples of everything, especially that oily residue they'd left in the dirt. Officer Garrett drove me back to my car and followed me home to make sure I got there safe. I filed a full report, but nothing ever came of it. I still hike, but never alone anymore, and definitely never at Pine Creek Gorge. The trail that afternoon was supposed to be nothing more than a chance for me and my 2 friends, Lauren and Emily, to get away from classes and breathe a little. We had driven out early, parked near the visitor center, and packed light. Just some water, snacks, and a blanket we thought we'd spread out once we reached one of the overlooks. The kind of day where you don't expect much. Just trees, the crunch of gravel under boots, and conversations that wander as much as the path itself. By the time we reached the halfway point, we had already crossed paths with several other hikers, most of them couples or small families. There was only one person who stood out, a man walking alone, wearing a faded green windbreaker, carrying no visible backpack and keeping his hands tucked inside the pockets as if he didn't have a reason to use them. We stepped aside when he passed, offered the polite nod strangers give on the trail, and thought nothing of it. Hours later, the air had shifted. Shadows stretched longer across the dirt, and the temperature began to slip just enough that I pulled my hoodie tighter. That's when Emily, who was leading, stopped abruptly and turned her head toward me and Lauren. She whispered that the same man was ahead of us again, leaning against a wooden signpost as if he'd been waiting there. I brushed it off, telling myself he must have taken one of the shorter loops that reconnected with ours. But the uneasy silence between the 3 of us said we were all thinking the same thing. We slowed our pace, trying to keep conversation going, but it felt forced. The trees seemed louder than us, every rustle of leaves, every branch snapping under a squirrel's weight. When we reached the next bend, he was gone again, just vanished into the deeper part of the woods. We told ourselves it was fine, that people cross paths on trails all the time, but I caught Lauren chewing at her lip, eyes darting to the tree line. Something about the way he carried himself didn't match the easygoing rhythm of a casual hiker. At some point we reached a fork where the trail split, one side heading back toward the main loop and the other winding deeper into the forest. We chose the loop that would eventually lead us back to the parking area, and for a while, I convinced myself the unease was just nerves. But then, maybe 15 minutes in, the sound of boots striking gravel echoed from behind us. When we turned, there he was again. Same green jacket, same slow, deliberate walk, closing the distance without saying a word. Lauren suggested we stop for water, hoping maybe he'd pass and continue on. But instead he slowed too, hovering just far enough that he didn't overtake us. It felt intentional, like he wanted to keep us in sight but not close enough to start a conversation. Emily muttered that we should pick up the pace, and we did, but no matter how quick our steps got, his rhythm matched ours. The sun had dropped lower, streaks of orange fading behind the tree line, and every shadow stretched like it was chasing us. The further we went, the fewer people we saw. Earlier, the trail had felt busy. Dogs, kids, the occasional runner. But now it was thinning out until it was only us and him. We tried to act natural, laughing louder than we needed to, forcing small talk about dinner plans. But every time I glanced back, his figure was there. Not hurried, not casual, just steady, like he knew we'd eventually run out of daylight. When the woods grew dim, we agreed silently that we needed to cut through to the access road that led back toward the visitor center. Emily had the map on her phone, and even though service was spotty, she guided us off the main trail. The shift in terrain made our steps louder, crunching twigs and leaves, and I couldn't help but glance back every few seconds. The problem was, no matter which way we turned, he always seemed to appear again, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, as if he knew shortcuts through the forest that we didn't. By then, my nerves were raw. Every twig snapping under our boots sounded like it belonged to him instead. When we finally spotted the narrow access road through the trees, it felt like a lifeline. We pushed through the brush and stumbled onto the gravel, our breaths sharp and quick. For a moment, I let myself believe that was it, that the open space meant safety. But then, from further up the road, the green windbreaker stepped out from the tree line like he'd been waiting there the whole time. Emily swore under her breath, and Lauren grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. There weren't any other cars or hikers in sight, just the stretch of road leading back toward the parking lot. We didn't even bother talking. All three of us broke into a run. My lungs screamed. The straps of my backpack dug into my shoulders, and I could hear his footsteps pounding behind us, heavier than before, closing distance in bursts. The relief when the visitor center came into view is hard to explain. A ranger truck was parked out front, headlights still on, and 2 staff members were standing near the entrance. The second they noticed us sprinting, one of them called out. That was enough to stop him. When I turned back, he'd frozen in place at the edge of the tree line, watching. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the woods as if he'd never been there. We told the rangers everything, giving as many details as we could. The jacket, his height, the way he always reappeared. They sent another officer down the trails with a flashlight, but no one ever found him. To this day, I can't explain how he always managed to be ahead or behind us without us seeing him cut through. All I know is that I haven't set foot on a trail that's secluded since, and I doubt I ever will again. It was a fall break a few years back when my brother and I decided to get out of the city for a couple of days. He had just finished his first semester at a community college, and I was stuck in a dead-end retail job that left me restless most nights. We thought a quick hiking trip would be the kind of reset we both needed. The national park we picked wasn't one of those huge tourist traps. It was quieter, with long stretches of forest where you could walk for hours without hearing another person's voice. That solitude was exactly what drew us there in the first place. My brother's name is Daniel, and he's always been more adventurous than me. He has this way of convincing people, especially me, that just one more mile is no big deal. That morning, we had been following a marked trail with the usual colored blazes painted on trees. The leaves had started to turn, and the canopy above us filtered the sunlight in patches of amber and green. Everything felt calm, almost too calm. Like the kind of peace you don't notice until it stretches on a little longer than you expect. Somewhere along the way, Daniel pointed out carvings on a cluster of pines just off the main trail. They weren't the official blazes. These looked more like someone had hacked at the bark with a hunting knife. The cuts were rough but deliberate, each one forming an arrow pointing deeper into the woods. It didn't look like vandalism. It looked like a system, as if someone had taken time to mark a path for others to follow. Daniel got that look in his eyes, the one that always meant we were about to do something dumb just for the thrill of it. I argued, of course. I told him we didn't know where it led, that it wasn't on the map, and that the sun would start dropping before too long. But he laughed, said we had plenty of daylight left, and started down the unmarked trail before I even gave an answer. I didn't want to be the boring older brother trailing behind, so I followed. At first, it felt exciting, like we were in on a secret no one else knew about. The forest grew thicker, quieter, and the air had this faint smell of damp earth and cedar that clung to my jacket as we walked further from the main path. The deeper we went, the stranger it felt. The official trails always had a certain look to them: trampled dirt, a few discarded water bottles, maybe even a bench or two at scenic spots. This one had none of that. The ground was soft and uneven, with roots jutting out like bones under skin. I noticed the arrows weren't random either. They always appeared right when the path seemed to fade, guiding us forward like breadcrumbs. Whoever made them didn't want anyone to turn back easily. It didn't sit right with me, but Daniel treated it like some kind of treasure hunt. After maybe an hour, the forest around us felt denser. The canopy blotted out most of the sky, and the sounds of the park, distant voices, the rush of a creek, had disappeared. What replaced them was silence, the heavy kind that makes your ears ring. That's when I realized I hadn't seen any animals for a while. Not a squirrel, not a bird overhead. Just us, walking deeper into a place that didn't feel like it belonged to the rest of the park anymore. At one point, we reached a clearing with an old tree stump in the center. The bark had been stripped off, and carved into the flat surface was the same arrow symbol we'd been following. Only this one was bigger, etched carefully like it was meant to be a landmark. Daniel touched it like he was impressed, but I felt a sharp unease. It wasn't a random shortcut. This trail was organized, intentional. Someone had gone through the effort of creating it, and that someone didn't want casual hikers to know about it. I told Daniel again we should turn back, but he shrugged me off and kept going. The arrows beyond that point grew rougher, almost rushed, but they still pushed us forward. I remember thinking how far we'd wandered because when I checked the time on my phone, more than 3 hours had passed since we left the main trail. No reception bars, of course. The air felt cooler, heavier, and even though the sun shouldn't have been setting yet, the woods seemed darker than they had any right to be. By the 4th hour, Daniel finally admitted we were lost. The arrows kept showing up, but instead of reassurance, they felt mocking. I tried to retrace our steps, but the forest looked the same in every direction. The air was damp, and I swear I could smell smoke somewhere far off, though there were no campgrounds marked in this section of the park. The deeper we walked, the more I felt like we weren't supposed to be there at all, like we'd stepped into a place that existed just outside the edges of the official map. We eventually stumbled across something that made my skin crawl. Another clearing, this one with a crude wooden structure leaning against a cluster of trees. It wasn't a shelter in the normal sense. It looked more like a blind someone would use for hunting, except it had carvings all over the planks. The same arrow shapes scratched over and over until the wood was scarred with them. Daniel tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't a random trail. It was built to funnel people here. That was the breaking point. I forced Daniel to agree that we needed to turn around, even if it meant backtracking blindly. We walked for hours, ignoring the arrows, heading whichever way the terrain sloped until we finally heard water. Following the sound brought us to a stream, and from there we managed to reconnect with a marked trail, just as the last light faded. I don't think I've ever felt relief hit so hard as when I saw that painted blaze again. To this day, I wonder who created that path. It wasn't some ranger's shortcut. There were no signs, no records, nothing on any map we checked afterward. The fact that the arrows led deeper and deeper instead of circling back is what unsettles me the most. Someone wanted strangers to follow, and they made damn sure the way out wasn't easy. We never told anyone at the park office. Part of me still regrets that, but another part is glad I didn't have to explain why 2 brothers followed a trail that was never meant to exist. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. October in Tennessee usually means perfect camping weather, and that's exactly what me and Kayla were counting on. We were both 24, grinding away at our desk jobs in Nashville. She was at a marketing firm downtown, and I was doing data entry for a medical billing company. The kind of work that makes you stare at the clock every 5 minutes, wondering how it's only Tuesday. We'd been texting each other camping spots for weeks, sending links to different trails during our lunch breaks. until we finally settled on this remote area in the Cherokee National Forest. Kayla and I had been friends since middle school, the type who could spend hours together without saying a word and still have a good time. We weren't hardcore outdoorsy types or anything, just two people who needed trees instead of traffic, stars instead of streetlights, and the sound of wind through leaves instead of our bosses asking for status updates. The plan was simple. Drive out Friday morning, hike to a clearing we'd found on some camping forum, spend 2 nights under the stars, and come back Sunday feeling like actual human beings again. My old Subaru Outback was packed to the ceiling with our tent, sleeping bags, a cooler full of food, and probably way more gear than 2 people needed for a weekend trip. The drive out took about 3 hours from Nashville, the last 40 minutes on this narrow gravel road that had my car groaning with every pothole. We pulled into the trailhead parking area around noon, and I remember feeling this wave of relief when we saw it was completely empty. No other cars, no voices echoing through the trees, just us and miles of forest. The trail to our camping spot was marked with faded blue blazes on the trees, supposedly 3 miles to a clearing that previous campers had described as secluded paradise. Kayla brought this old film camera she'd found at Goodwill, and she kept making me stop so she could photograph these enormous oak trees with bark so deeply grooved it looked prehistoric. The forest felt alive in all the right ways, birds having full conversations above us, chipmunks darting across the trail, and this steady breeze that made the whole canopy sway like it was breathing. After about 2 hours of hiking, our packs digging into our shoulders and sweat staining our shirts, we finally emerged into the clearing. It was exactly what the forum had promised. A flat, open space about the size of a basketball court, surrounded by towering pines with an old fire ring made from gathered stones, and a massive fallen tree that would work perfectly as a bench. We dropped our packs and just stood there for a minute, breathing in that thick forest air, feeling like we'd found exactly what we'd been searching for. Setting up camp took us about an hour, mostly because Kayla insisted on finding the perfect angle for the tent so we'd wake up with sunlight hitting us just right. While she fussed with the tent stakes, I gathered kindling for later and explored the edges of our little clearing. There were these weird marks on some of the pine trees, deep gouges in the bark about shoulder height, almost like someone had been carving into them with a knife but stopped halfway through. I figured it was probably from hunters marking territory, or maybe bears scratching, though I didn't mention the bear possibility to Kayla, since she was already paranoid about wildlife. By late afternoon, we had everything set up, tent secured, sleeping bags rolled out. Our food hung up in a bear bag between 2 trees about 50 feet from camp. The forest had gotten quieter as the day wore on, that busy chatter of birds fading to just occasional calls in the distance. We made sandwiches and sat on the fallen log, watching the sunlight filter through the pine needles in these golden streams that made everything look like a painting. Kayla was going on about how her boss had tried to call her that morning about some campaign deadline, and we were both laughing about how there was no way anyone could reach us out here, our phones showing no service since we'd left the main road. Around 5 o'clock, just as we were debating whether to start the fire or go explore a bit more before dark, we heard footsteps on the trail. Not the light, quick steps of a deer or the shuffling of a raccoon. These were deliberate, heavy boot steps crunching through the leaves. A man emerged from the tree line, and right away, everything about him seemed wrong for the setting. He was wearing clean khaki pants and a button-up shirt, like he'd dressed for a business casual Friday, not a hiking trail. His hair was slicked back with so much gel it looked wet, and he had this perfectly trimmed goatee that belonged in a suburban office park, not the middle of the Cherokee National Forest. But what really made my chest tighten was the rifle slung over his shoulder. Not unusual for Tennessee. Hunters were everywhere, but it was the way he carried it. Too casual, like it was a fashion accessory rather than a tool. He stopped at the edge of our clearing, maybe 20 feet from where we were sitting, and just stared at us. Not a friendly, "Oh hey fellow campers" look, but this cold assessment, like he was cataloging everything about our campsite. Kayla grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks, and we both stayed frozen on that log, waiting for him to say something, to explain why he was just standing there watching us. "You girls don't belong here," he finally said, and his voice had this weird flatness to it, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized. He took 3 steps into our clearing, his dress shoes, actual leather dress shoes, crunching on the pine needles and leaves. The rifle shifted on his shoulder, and I could see it better now. Some kind of hunting rifle with a scope that looked expensive, the metal gleaming like it had been polished that morning. His eyes were this pale gray color, almost silver in the fading sunlight, and they never blinked as he looked between me and Kayla. "This is private property, family land, goes back generations." The way he said it, emphasizing each word like we were children who needed things explained slowly, made my skin prickle with anger and fear. At the same time, Kayla found her voice first, always the brave one, and said we'd checked all the maps, that this was national forest land, public camping allowed with proper permits. He smiled then, but it was all teeth and no warmth, the kind of smile you'd see on someone enjoying a cruel joke. "Maps can be wrong," he said, taking another step closer. "Government makes mistakes all the time, but we know what's ours." I stood up slowly, pulling Kayla with me, trying to keep my voice steady as I told him we'd leave immediately if there was a misunderstanding. My legs felt like water, but I forced myself to move toward our tent, thinking if we could just pack up quickly and get out of there, everything would be fine. But he moved too, positioning himself between us and the trail we'd come in on, still with that horrible empty smile stretched across his face. "Where you from?" he asked, like we were having a normal conversation, like he wasn't blocking our only exit. "Nashville," Kayla answered, her voice higher than usual. "City girls," he said, almost whispering it, like it was a curse word. "Coming out here, thinking you own the place, setting up camp wherever you please." His free hand, the one not holding the rifle strap, kept opening and closing into a fist, and I noticed his fingernails were weirdly long for a man, filed into points that looked sharp enough to scratch. The sun was dropping behind the trees now, casting these long shadows across the clearing, and I realized with growing panic that even if we ran, we'd be hiking in the dark soon, 3 miles through unfamiliar forest with this man potentially following us. "We'll pack up right now," I said again, louder this time, already moving toward the tent. No need for trouble. We didn't know. But he just stood there, watching us with those unblinking silver eyes, his pointed fingernails now tapping against the rifle stock in this steady rhythm that sounded like a countdown. We started packing frantically, shoving sleeping bags into stuff sacks without rolling them properly, yanking tent stakes out of the ground so hard one bent completely in half. The man had moved again, now standing near the fire ring, running his fingers along the stones like he was inspecting our work. "You know what we do to trespassers out here?" he asked, his voice carrying across the clearing even though he was practically whispering. "Same thing we've always done. Same thing my daddy did and his daddy before him." Kayla dropped the tent pole she was holding, the metal clanging against a rock, and the sound seemed to echo forever in the growing darkness. I could hear her breathing getting faster, these little gasps that meant she was close to a panic attack, something I'd only seen happen once before when we got lost driving through Kentucky. The man unslung his rifle, not pointing it at us yet, just cradling it in his arms like a baby, running those sharp fingernails along the wooden stock. "There's stories about these woods," he continued, taking slow, measured steps around the edge of our clearing, like an animal circling prey. Stories about girls who didn't listen, who thought they knew better. Every instinct in my body was screaming to run, but our packs were still half full, our bear bag still hanging in the tree, and I knew we'd need at least some supplies if we had any chance of making it back to the car in the dark. Then we heard it, another set of footsteps coming from the opposite side of the clearing, from deeper in the forest where no trail existed. A second man emerged, younger, maybe early 20s, with the same silver eyes but wild, uncombed hair that hung to his shoulders in greasy strands. He was wearing overalls with no shirt underneath, his chest covered in these intricate scars that looked deliberate, like someone had carved patterns into his skin. "Found them just like you said, Uncle Roy," the younger one called out, and his voice had this sing-song quality that made everything he said sound like a taunt. He was carrying something in his right hand. At first I thought it was a stick, but as he got closer I could see it was a machete, the blade rusty except for the edge, which gleamed sharp and clean. 2 of them, just like those ones from last spring. My whole body went rigid at that comment. Kayla made this small whimpering sound and grabbed my hand, squeezing so hard I thought my bones might break. Uncle Roy, apparently that was the first man's name, smiled wider, showing teeth that were too white, too perfect, like dentures that didn't quite fit his mouth. "City girls never learn," he said, shifting his rifle so it was pointed vaguely in our direction. Not quite aimed, but close enough to make the threat clear. "They come out here with their fancy gear and their maps, thinking the whole world belongs to them." The younger one laughed, this high-pitched giggle that didn't match his scarred chest and wild appearance, spinning the machete in his hand like a baton. "Please," I heard myself say, surprised that my voice came out at all. "We're leaving, right now. We won't tell anyone about this place, we promise." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew how pathetic they sounded. The nephew, I couldn't think of him any other way, had moved to block the other side of the clearing, the side that led deeper into the forest. We were trapped between them, 2 girls with half-packed camping gear against 2 armed locals who knew every tree, every rock, every hiding spot for miles. Uncle Roy took the rifle off his shoulder completely now, checking the chamber with practiced ease. "You know what the problem is with promises from city folk?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. "They don't mean nothing, just words, like when the government promised to leave our land alone." He spat on the ground, this thick wad of tobacco juice that landed near our tent. The darkness was coming fast now, that sudden mountain darkness where 1 minute you can see everything and the next you can barely make out shapes. Our flashlights were in our packs, but reaching for them felt like it might trigger something, might make these men stop talking and start doing whatever they'd been planning since they found us. Kayla's panic attack was getting worse. I could feel her whole body shaking against mine, could hear those gasping breaths getting shorter and shorter. Without warning, Uncle Roy raised the rifle and fired into the air, the sound exploding through the clearing like thunder. Both Kayla and I screamed, dropping to the ground instinctively, our ears ringing from the blast. When I looked up, both men were laughing, the nephew actually doubling over and slapping his knee like it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. "Run!" Uncle Roy said, lowering the rifle until it was pointed directly at us. "You got 30 seconds head start. Better make them count." For a heartbeat, neither of us moved, our brains refusing to process what was happening. Then the nephew started counting, loud and slow. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Kayla yanked me to my feet and we ran, leaving everything behind, our tent, our packs, our phones, everything except the clothes on our backs. We crashed through the underbrush in the opposite direction from both men, branches tearing at our faces and arms, roots trying to trip us with every step. Behind us, I could hear the nephew's voice getting fainter. 15 Mississippi. 16 Mississippi. My mind was racing, trying to remember anything about the area from the maps we'd studied. There was a creek somewhere to the east, and if we could find it, we could follow it downstream to eventually hit a road. But in the darkness, with no compass, no light, east might as well have been Mars. We kept running, our breathing so loud I was sure they could track us by sound alone, waiting for the counting to stop, waiting for the hunt to begin. The counting stopped at 30, and then we heard the worst sound possible, whooping and hollering like this was some kind of celebration. Another gunshot cracked through the air, not aimed at us but fired into the sky, followed by that high-pitched laugh from the nephew. We kept running blind through the darkness, holding hands so we wouldn't lose each other, when suddenly Kayla's foot caught on something and we both went down hard. My knee hit a rock and I felt the skin tear open, warm blood immediately soaking through my jeans. but the pain was nothing compared to the terror when we heard branches breaking somewhere behind us, not far, maybe 100 yards. They were tracking us, and they were getting closer. Kayla pulled me behind a massive fallen tree, and we pressed ourselves against the rotting bark, trying to control our breathing. My heart was pounding so hard I was convinced they'd hear it. For maybe 5 minutes we stayed frozen there, listening to them crashing through the forest, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. Then I remembered something. My car keys were in my pocket, and attached to them was a tiny LED keychain light my mom had given me. With shaking fingers, I pulled it out and clicked it on, the weak beam barely penetrating 3 feet into the darkness. But it was enough to see that we were near a steep slope heading downward, and at the bottom I could hear it, water running over rocks. We half slid, half fell down that slope, using trees to slow our descent, both of us getting covered in mud and dead leaves. The creek was maybe 10 feet wide, shallow but moving fast, cold enough to take your breath away when we splashed into it. But we didn't stop, following it downstream, slipping on the algae-covered rocks, falling into the water over and over until we were soaked and shivering. Behind us, I heard Uncle Roy's voice, closer than expected. "They're in the water. Smart little things." Another gunshot, and this time I heard the bullet hit a tree somewhere to our left. We ran faster, the creek gradually widening, the sound of the water hopefully masking our splashing. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we saw lights through the trees, a house, then another, then the blessed sight of a paved road. We scrambled up the bank, our clothes weighing us down, and ran toward the nearest house where a porch light was on. The elderly woman who answered our frantic knocking took one look at us, soaked, bloody, crying, and immediately called 911 while pulling us inside. The police found our campsite destroyed, everything torn apart or stolen, but no trace of the 2 men. They said there were no families owning private land in that area, that it had been federal forest for 50 years. But they also said there had been other reports, other campers who'd been run off by locals claiming ownership, though none who'd been shot at before. Kayla and I drove back to Nashville in silence the next day, after giving our statements and declining to press charges we weren't even sure could stick. We never went camping again, and we never talked about that night after the first week. But sometimes I Google that area, looking for news stories about missing hikers, hoping I never find what I'm afraid is out there. Last August, I went camping with my college friends at Pine Ridge State Park in Colorado. We were all nursing graduates who'd just finished our boards, and this trip was our celebration before everyone scattered to different hospitals across the country. There were 5 of us, me, Jessica, Amber, Nicole, and Megan, and we'd picked a campsite pretty deep into the park, about 40 minutes from the main road. The spot was perfect, surrounded by tall pines and next to a small creek that made this peaceful bubbling sound. We'd spent the whole day hiking, roasting marshmallows, and catching up on life. By the time we crawled into our tents around 11, I was exhausted in that good way you get after a day outdoors. Jessica and I were sharing one tent, Amber and Nicole had another, and Megan had brought her own small one because she snored and didn't want to keep anyone awake. I remember waking up to this soft, polite knocking on our tent. Not banging or scratching, just 3 gentle taps, like someone knocking on an office door. My phone showed 2:07 a.m. when I checked it, the brightness making me squint. At first I thought maybe Megan needed something. Maybe she'd forgotten her water bottle or had to use the bathroom and was scared to go alone. But then I heard this voice, and it definitely wasn't Megan's. "Excuse me? Hello, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I really need some help." The voice was high and sweet, with this slight southern drawl that reminded me of my aunt from Georgia. Jessica was still dead asleep beside me, snoring softly with her arm thrown over her face. I lay there for a second, trying to process what was happening. The woman knocked again, still gentle, still polite. "Please, I know it's late, but my phone died, and I'm lost. I just need to make a quick call." I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent flap, just enough to peek out. What I saw made every muscle in my body tense up. There was a woman standing about 3 feet from our tent, and she looked completely out of place. She was wearing a floral sundress, the kind with tiny yellow daisies on white fabric, and these strappy sandals with little heels. Her hair was done up in this elaborate bun with what looked like pearl pins holding it in place. She had on full makeup too, red lipstick and everything, like she'd just come from a wedding reception or a fancy dinner. But here's what really got me. She had absolutely nothing with her. No backpack, no purse, no phone, no flashlight, no jacket. Nothing. The nearest parking area was at least a 30-minute hike through rough terrain, and she was standing there in heels and a sundress like she'd just stepped out of a garden party. The woman smiled when she saw me, and it was this perfectly normal, friendly smile that you'd expect from someone asking for directions at a grocery store. "Oh, thank goodness you're awake. I'm so embarrassed, but I got separated from my group, and I've been walking for hours trying to find my way back to the parking lot." Her voice never wavered, stayed perfectly pleasant and calm. I asked her what group she was with, and she tilted her head slightly, like she was thinking. We were having a little get-together, a celebration actually, but I went for a walk to see the stars, and I guess I wandered too far. She laughed, this tinkling little sound that seemed rehearsed. The thing is, there were no other campsites near us. We'd specifically chosen this spot because it was isolated. And there definitely weren't any celebrations or parties happening in the middle of the forest on a random Friday night. I told her I could let her use my phone, and I started reaching back into the tent to grab it from my sleeping bag. That's when she took a step closer and said, "Actually, would you mind walking me back to the main trail? I'm terrible with directions and I'd probably just get lost again." She clasped her hands in front of her, like she was praying, and gave me this hopeful look. Every instinct I had was screaming at me that something was wrong with this whole situation. Who gets lost in heels? Who goes for a nighttime walk in the forest wearing a sundress? And how did she even find our specific campsite in the dark? I told her I'd wake up my friends and we could all help her together. The moment I said that, her expression changed for just a split second. This flash of frustration crossed her face before the smile snapped back into place. "Oh no, please don't wake them. I'd feel so guilty disturbing everyone." "You seem so kind, couldn't you just point me in the right direction?" Before I could answer, I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. From somewhere behind the woman, deeper in the forest, came this low whistle. Not a bird, it was definitely human. The woman didn't react to it at all, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge it, just kept staring at me with that same pleasant smile. Then another whistle answered from the opposite direction, maybe 50 feet to our left. And another one behind our tents. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The woman was still talking, something about how she just needed a few minutes of my time, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was counting the whistles. There were at least 4 different directions they were coming from, and they were getting closer. The woman must have noticed my expression because she reached out her hand toward me. "Please, honey, I really need your help. Just come with me for a minute." Her fingers were inches from the tent flap, and that's when I noticed her nails. They were caked with dirt underneath, like she'd been digging in the ground. I yanked the zipper shut so fast I almost broke it. The woman's voice immediately changed, dropping the sweet southern accent entirely. "Open the tent." It was flat, emotionless, like she was reading from a script. I shook Jessica awake, clamping my hand over her mouth before she could say anything. Her eyes went wide when she saw my face, and I whispered that we needed to wake the others now. The woman outside had gone quiet, but I could hear footsteps circling our tent, slow and deliberate. Then more footsteps from different directions, converging on our campsite. Jessica grabbed the emergency whistle from her backpack, while I fumbled with my phone to call 911. But there was no signal. We were too deep in the park. The footsteps stopped. Everything went completely silent for maybe 10 seconds. Then all hell broke loose. Someone started shaking Megan's tent violently, and I heard her scream. At the same time, something heavy slammed into the side of our tent, nearly knocking it over. Jessica started blowing the emergency whistle as loud as she could, while I screamed for everyone to stay in their tents and call for help. The beam of my flashlight swung wildly as I tried to see what was happening, and I caught glimpses through the tent fabric. There were at least 5 people out there, all dressed in regular street clothes, all wrong for camping. A man in khakis and a polo shirt was pulling at Amber and Nicole's tent stakes. Another woman in a cocktail dress was cutting through Megan's rainfly with something sharp. They weren't saying anything, just working systematically like they'd done this before. Jessica kept blowing that whistle, and I started hitting the emergency button on my phone even though there was no signal, hoping maybe it would store the GPS location or something. Then Amber did something that probably saved us. She had this air horn in her tent that she'd brought as a joke to wake us up in the morning, and she started blasting it over and over. The sound was deafening, echoing through the forest like a siren. The attackers actually stopped for a second, and I saw them looking at each other. The woman in the sundress made this sharp gesture with her hand, and they all started moving faster, more aggressively. But Amber kept hitting that air horn, and within maybe 30 seconds we heard dogs barking in the distance. There was another camping group about a half-mile away that had 2 German shepherds, and those dogs were going crazy. Then we saw flashlight beams bouncing through the trees, getting closer, and male voices shouting, asking if everything was okay. The woman in the sundress whistled once, sharp and loud, and just like that, they all stopped and melted back into the forest. The other campers reached us about 2 minutes later, 3 guys and an older couple with their dogs. They found us huddled together between our ruined tents, Jessica still clutching the whistle, Amber holding the air horn like a weapon. Megan's tent was completely destroyed, slashed to ribbons. All our stakes had been pulled up, our stuff scattered everywhere. The men helped us gather what we could while the woman called the Rangers on their satellite phone. We didn't wait for them to arrive. We hiked out in the dark with our rescuers, leaving most of our gear behind. The dogs kept growling and looking back into the forest the whole way, hackles raised, like they knew those people were still out there watching us. At the ranger station, we filed reports and gave descriptions, but the rangers seemed weirdly unsurprised. One of them, this older guy with gray hair, pulled me aside and told me we were lucky. He said there had been similar incidents over the past 5 years. Groups of people in strange clothes approaching campers at night, always with some polite request for help, always trying to separate one person from their group. He showed me a map with red pins marking the incidents, and there were at least 12 of them, all in remote camping areas within a 100-mile radius. The most recent one before ours had happened just 3 weeks earlier. A solo hiker who'd thankfully locked himself in his car when a well-dressed elderly man knocked on his tent at 3 a.m., asking for jumper cables. The ranger said they suspected it was some kind of organized group, maybe human traffickers or something worse, but they could never find any trace of them afterward. No footprints, no campsite, no vehicles, nothing. Just traumatized campers and destroyed gear. He gave me his direct number and said to call if I remembered any other details. 2 months later, I got a call from him. They'd arrested 8 people after they tried the same thing on an off-duty cop who was camping with his family. Turns out it was this group that had been kidnapping campers for years, taking them across state lines. They'd pick isolated spots, send in someone non-threatening looking first to gauge the situation, then attack if they couldn't lure someone away peacefully. The woman in the sundress was apparently the ringleader's wife. We were lucky that night, luckier than I probably realize even now. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd stepped out of that tent to help her, if Jessica hadn't woken up, if Amber hadn't brought that air horn. The ranger told me they found evidence that the group had been watching us all day, waiting for night to fall. They'd probably seen 5 young women and thought we'd be easy targets. What still haunts me is how normal that woman seemed at first, how her request for help was so reasonable sounding. I've gone camping since then, but never without a satellite phone, never in isolated spots, and I always trust my gut when something doesn't add up. If someone knocks on your tent in the middle of the night, no matter how polite they sound, no matter how much they say they need help, don't open it. Real hikers in trouble don't approach sleeping campers at 2 a.m. dressed for a dinner party. They just don't. The old Riverside Playhouse had been abandoned for 12 years when we decided to drive out there that Saturday night. People in town had started calling it the Purple Castle, after some kids swore they saw the cross on top glowing violet at midnight, which sounded like complete bullshit, until half the senior class started talking about it. The building sat on Route 47, about 6 miles past the last gas station, this massive brick structure that used to be a Methodist church before someone turned it into a community theater. My dad's construction company had actually bid on the renovation project years ago, so I knew the layout pretty well from the old blueprints he kept in his office. The place had these narrow Gothic windows that were mostly broken now, and the white paint had peeled off in sheets that looked like dead skin. During the day, it was just another eyesore the county kept promising to tear down, but at night, with the fog rolling in from the creek behind it, the whole structure seemed to lean forward like it was listening for something. Travis had been obsessing over the story for weeks, showing up at my house with screenshots from local Facebook groups and blurry photos people had posted. His cousin Bethany was visiting from Michigan for Thanksgiving break, and she thought we were all idiots for believing any of it, but she came along anyway because sitting around watching her aunt's cable TV was worse than chasing small-town legends. We took my dad's F-150, this beast of a truck with a bent tailgate and a dashboard that rattled like dice in a cup whenever you hit 40 miles per hour. The heater only worked if you punched the vents just right, and Bethany spent the first 10 minutes of the drive trying to get warm air flowing, while Travis went through his evidence folder on his phone. The route out there took us through the back roads past the Foster farm, where their 3-legged dog always tried to race vehicles along the fence line, past the water tower some genius had painted to look like a giant golf ball, through stretches of woods so thick the headlights seemed to get swallowed up after 20 feet. We pulled into the gravel lot around 11:45, and the first thing I noticed was how wrong the silence felt. Not peaceful quiet like you'd expect from an empty building, but this heavy absence of sound that made your ears ring. The playhouse loomed above us, 4 stories of brick and broken dreams, with that metal cross on top catching the moonlight in a way that made it look silver. Definitely not purple. Travis immediately started filming with his phone while Bethany and I grabbed the flashlights from behind the driver's seat. The main entrance had been boarded up years ago, but kids had pried open a side door near the loading dock, where they used to bring in set pieces. Inside, the air tasted like mold and bird shit, and our footsteps echoed in that specific way that tells you a place has been empty for too long. The lobby still had the old ticket booth with its brass bars, and someone had spray-painted "Abandon Hope" across the concession stand, because apparently even vandals in our town were pretentious English majors. The main theater was through a set of double doors that groaned like they were in physical pain when we pushed them open. Rows of red velvet seats stretched toward a stage where the curtain had partially collapsed, hanging there like a massive tongue. Travis kept whispering about electromagnetic fields and temperature drops while waving his phone around, but all I could focus on was this weird smell, like copper pennies mixed with something chemical. Bethany found the stairs to the balcony behind what used to be the coat check, and we followed her up, our flashlight beams dancing across water-stained walls covered in graffiti dating back decades. From up there, you could see the whole theater, including the orchestra pit filled with broken chairs and what looked like old bird nests made from programs and sheet music. The ceiling had partially caved in near the back, creating this jagged hole where you could see straight through to the bell tower, where the cross was mounted. At exactly midnight, Travis's phone started going haywire, the screen flickering between apps he wasn't even touching, the flashlight function turning on and off in this rapid strobe that hurt to look at. Then we heard it. This deep grinding sound from above us, like concrete scraping against metal, slow and deliberate. Bethany grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks, and we all looked up at that hole in the ceiling just as something moved across it, blocking out the stars for a second. Not floating or flying, but climbing maybe, using the exposed beams like a jungle gym. The cross hadn't turned purple, but there was this faint violet glow coming from somewhere behind it, pulsing like a heartbeat. Travis tried to zoom in with his phone camera, but the thing kept refusing to focus, showing nothing but blur and static. The grinding sound got louder, and pieces of plaster started raining down from the edges of the hole, hitting the seats below with sharp little pops that sounded like bones breaking. That's when we saw the first claw mark appear on one of the exposed wooden beams, fresh splinters curling away from 4 parallel gouges that had to be 8 inches long. Whatever was up there was heavy enough to make the whole building groan, and it was moving toward the ladder that led down from the bell tower, the same ladder we'd need to pass to get back to the stairs. My dad had taught me to recognize stress sounds in old buildings, and what I was hearing now meant something way too big was putting weight on structures that were already compromised. Bethany was already backing toward the balcony stairs, her flashlight beam shaking so bad it looked like a disco ball, while Travis kept muttering "holy shit" over and over, still trying to film even though his hands were trembling. Another scraping sound echoed through the theater, closer this time, and a shower of wood dust drifted down through our flashlight beams like snow. The smell got stronger too, that copper penny stench mixed with something else, something organic and wrong, like roadkill that had been baking in the sun. We ran down those balcony stairs so fast I'm surprised nobody broke their neck, our footsteps thundering through the empty building while that grinding, scraping noise followed from above. In the lobby, Travis tripped over a pile of old programs and went down hard, his phone skittering across the floor, still recording, the light spinning crazily across the walls. As Bethany and I hauled him up, we heard the unmistakable sound of wood splintering above us, followed by a crash that shook dust from every surface. Through the doorway to the theater, we could see something dropping from the ceiling in chunks. Not just plaster and wood, but something dark and wet that hit the seats with heavy, meaty thuds. The side door we'd entered through was only 20 feet away, but those were the longest 20 feet of my life, especially when we heard whatever was up there start moving faster. The building's old bones creaking and popping under its weight like knuckles cracking. We burst out of the building into the cold November air, and the difference in temperature made my lungs burn. The truck was right where we'd left it, thank God, and I had the keys out before we even reached it, my fingers fumbling with the keychain my dad had made from a piece of copper pipe. That's when Travis screamed and pointed at the roof of the playhouse, where something huge was perched on the bell tower, silhouetted against the moon. It was the size of a small car but moved like a massive cat, muscles rippling under what looked like patchy fur, or maybe feathers. I couldn't tell in the darkness. The purple glow was coming from behind it, from inside the bell tower itself, casting this sick violet outline around its body. The thing's head turned toward us, and even from 50 yards away, I could see eyes that reflected our flashlights like a deer's, except there were too many of them, arranged wrong, scattered across what should have been its face. It made this sound, not quite a roar, more like a deep whistle mixed with grinding metal, and started climbing down the side of the building, its claws leaving deep gouges in the brick. The truck started on the second try, which was a miracle considering how temperamental that engine could be in cold weather. I threw it in reverse so hard the transmission screamed, spinning gravel everywhere as we tore out of the parking lot. Behind us, I could hear that thing hit the ground with a thud that I swear we felt through the truck's chassis, and then came the sound of it running, heavy rhythmic impacts that were gaining on us way too fast for something that size. Bethany was turned around in her seat, watching through the back window, her voice climbing higher with each word as she described it, loping after us on all fours, covering maybe 15 feet with each bound. The truck's speedometer hit 60 on that narrow access road, way too fast for the conditions. But I didn't care because in the side mirror I could see those eyes getting closer, all 6 or 7 of them glowing in the reflection of our taillights. Then it jumped, and I mean really jumped, launching itself through the air in this impossible arc that brought it down right in the truck bed with an impact that lifted the front wheels off the ground for a second. The whole truck lurched sideways as 3,000 pounds of muscle and fury landed in the bed, and I fought to keep us on the road while metal screamed and bent behind us. Through the rear window we could see massive claws puncturing through the bed liner, each one as thick as my thumb and curved like meat hooks, scrabbling for purchase on the metal. The thing's weight made the truck fishtail wildly, and I could barely control it as we hit the main road doing 70. Travis was screaming something about calling 911, but what would we even say? That we were being chased by something that looked like a mountain lion crossed with a nightmare. The creature's face pressed against the back window for one horrible second, and up close I could see it had skin like a bat's wing stretched over too many bones. And those eyes weren't even in eye sockets, just stuck into the flesh wherever. It raised one massive paw and brought it down on the roof of the cab, and the metal buckled inward with a sound like a giant stepping on a soda can, safety glass from the rear window exploding into 1,000 little cubes that pelted us like hail. Just when I thought the roof was going to collapse completely, we hit the bridge over Miller's Creek doing almost 80, and the sudden change from asphalt to concrete joints made the whole truck bounce violently. The creature lost its grip for just a second, sliding backward in the truck bed with a furious shriek that sounded like tearing sheet metal. That's when I remembered the railroad crossing about a quarter-mile ahead, the one where you had to slow down to almost nothing unless you wanted to destroy your suspension. But slowing down meant giving that thing another chance to get at us through the now open rear window. I made the choice to hit it at full speed, yelling at Travis and Bethany to brace themselves. The impact when we hit those tracks was brutal, launching the entire truck airborne for what felt like forever, but was probably only a second or two. I heard the creature hit something hard as it got thrown from the bed, followed by the sound of it crashing through the woods beside the road, branches snapping like firecrackers. I didn't stop driving until we reached the 24-hour gas station at the edge of town, pulling up right under the brightest lights near the door. My dad's truck looked like it had been attacked by a gang with sledgehammers and pickaxes. The roof caved in, the bed torn to shreds with those massive claw marks gouged deep into the metal, some of them going clean through. The tailgate was hanging by one hinge, and there was this thick, dark substance splattered across the bed that smelled like a mixture of tar and spoiled meat. Travis threw up in the parking lot while Bethany called her mom with some story about hitting a deer. We never reported it to the cops, never went back to check on anything, just told my dad that vandals had trashed his truck while we were at a movie. He didn't believe us, obviously, but what was the alternative explanation? The local news ran a story 3 days later about a bear being spotted near the old playhouse, showed some blurry trail cam footage of something large moving through the trees. They brought in wildlife experts who said black bears sometimes grow much larger than usual when they have access to consistent food sources, maybe from the dumpsters behind the abandoned building. But I know what bears look like, and that thing had too many joints in its legs, too many eyes, and no bear leaves claw marks that go through quarter-inch steel. The Purple Castle is still standing out there on Route 47, and sometimes I drive past it during the day, but I always speed up when I do, and I never ever look at it after dark. Spring break of my junior year, me and 5 friends from college decided to go camping at this lake about 3 hours north of campus. We were all stressed out from midterms and figured a weekend in nature would help us decompress before the final push to summer. The place we picked was called Silver Pine Lake, one of those spots that locals knew about but wasn't overrun with tourists yet. My roommate Brandon had been there with his family a few years earlier and swore it was the perfect spot. Secluded enough to feel like real camping, but still close enough to civilization if we needed anything. We loaded up 2 cars with our gear on a Friday afternoon, cranked up the music, and hit the road feeling like we owned the world. The weather was perfect, mid-70s with zero chance of rain according to every app we checked. We even joked about how we were probably overpacking with all the tarps and rain covers we brought. The group was me, Brandon, this guy Nathan from our statistics class, Brandon's girlfriend Ashley, her roommate Claire, and Claire's cousin Jenna, who was visiting from out of state. We'd all hung out before at parties and study groups, but this was our first time doing something like this together. The drive up was perfect. Windows down, everyone taking turns with the music, stopping at this sketchy gas station that sold the best beef jerky I've ever had in my life. When we finally got to the lake around sunset, the water was like glass, reflecting all these insane orange and pink colors from the sky. We found a clearing about 50 yards from the shore, surrounded by pine trees on 3 sides, with a perfect view of the water. The spot already had a fire pit from previous campers, which we took as a good sign. We spent the next hour setting up our 3 tents, Brandon and Ashley in one, Nathan and I in another, and Claire and Jenna in the third. That first night was exactly what we'd hoped for. We got a fire going, cooked hot dogs and burgers, and sat around drinking beers and telling stories. Nathan brought his guitar and played some songs while we made s'mores. Around 11, we noticed another group had set up camp across the lake. We could see their fire flickering through the trees, maybe half a mile away. Ashley mentioned hearing voices carrying over the water earlier, but we couldn't make out what they were saying. The sounds out there were incredible. Owls hooting, fish jumping in the lake, branches creaking in the breeze. Claire kept making everyone shut up every few minutes so she could identify different bird calls with this app on her phone. By midnight, we were all pretty tired and decided to call it a night. I remember Nathan and I talking for maybe another 20 minutes in our tent about this girl he liked before we both passed out. I woke up around 7:30 because the sun was hitting our tent and it was getting warm inside. Nathan was still snoring next to me, so I tried to be quiet as I unzipped the tent flap to go take a leak. The morning was gorgeous. Mist coming off the lake, birds going crazy in the trees, that perfect camping morning smell of dew and pine needles. But when I stepped out and turned to zip the tent back up, I saw it. There was this cut running down the side of our tent, maybe 3 feet long, perfectly straight like someone had used a razor or a really sharp knife. The fabric was separated clean, and I could see Nathan's sleeping bag through the gap. At first, I thought maybe we'd snagged it on something while setting up, but the cut was too precise, too deliberate. Then I noticed the edges of the fabric were frayed outward, which meant it had been cut from the outside. My first instinct was to check if our stuff had been stolen. I ducked back into the tent and went through our backpacks. Wallets, phones, Brandon's expensive camera, Nathan's iPad, everything was still there. That made it even weirder. I woke Nathan up and showed him the cut, and he had the same reaction I did, checking all our gear while muttering, "What the hell," over and over. We went to check on Brandon and Ashley's tent, and that's when my chest got tight. Their tent had an identical cut, same length, same clean precision, running parallel to the ground about 2 feet up from the base. Brandon came crawling out when he heard us talking, took one look at the damage, and immediately went into protective mode, checking on Ashley and looking around the campsite like whoever did this might still be watching. The girl's tent was the worst. 2 cuts, forming an X pattern on the side facing the woods. Nobody wanted to say it out loud at first, but we all knew this was intentional. Someone had walked through our camp while we were sleeping and cut our tents with something sharp. But why? Nothing was missing, nobody was hurt, and there were no footprints or disturbed ground that we could see. Jenna pointed out that whoever did this had to be incredibly quiet. We were only 10 feet apart from each other, and nobody heard anything. The cuts were so clean that the person must have used a fresh blade, probably a box cutter or hunting knife. Ashley was trying to stay calm, but I could see her scrolling through her phone, probably checking if there was enough signal to call someone. Claire walked around the perimeter of our camp, using her phone to take pictures of everything, saying we should document this in case we needed to file a police report later. Brandon found a long stick and started poking through the bushes around our site, like he was expecting to find someone hiding there. We had a group meeting by the dead fire pit, everyone still in their sleep clothes, trying to figure out what to do. Nathan suggested it might have been animals, maybe a bear investigating our camp, but we all knew that was bullshit. Bears don't make surgical cuts in perfect lines. Brandon wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but Ashley pointed out it was only 8 in the morning, and we'd driven 3 hours to get here. Plus, we'd already paid for 2 nights at the campsite. Claire had a different theory. Maybe it was some kind of local hazing thing, teenagers from a nearby town messing with out-of-state campers. She'd found a forum post from 2 years ago mentioning vandalism at Silver Pine Lake, though nothing specifically about tent cutting. We spent the next hour going through everything, checking the car tires, making sure nothing else was damaged. I walked down to the lake shore, partly to clear my head, and partly to see if there were any other campers around who might have seen or heard something. The campsite across the lake was already empty. Their fire pit was cold when Nathan and I hiked over there around 9:30, but there were fresh tire tracks leading out to the access road. We found some cigarette butts, a few empty beer cans, and weirdly, a brand new roll of duct tape still in its packaging, just sitting on one of the logs they'd used as seats. Nathan picked it up, and we both had the same thought. Why would someone leave this behind? On our walk back, we ran into an older couple camping about a quarter mile down the shore. They had this massive RV and were cooking breakfast outside. The woman, Dorothy, said they'd been coming to Silver Pine for 15 years and had never heard of anything like what happened to us. Her husband mentioned seeing headlights moving through the woods around 2 in the morning, but he figured it was just someone arriving late. He said the lights stopped for about 10 minutes near where our camp would be, then continued toward the other side of the lake. When we got back and told everyone about the headlights, the mood shifted completely. Ashley started packing her stuff, saying she wasn't spending another night there, and I didn't blame her. But then Claire made a point that stuck with me. Whoever did this wanted to scare us, and if we left, they won. She suggested we stay but take precautions. We could move our tents closer together, take shifts staying awake, and keep the fire going all night. Nathan said his dad had taught him how to set up a perimeter alarm with fishing line and empty cans, which sounded paranoid at the time, but everyone agreed to it. We spent the rest of the morning fixing our tents with the duct tape we'd found, which seemed like cosmic irony, using what might have been the vandals' own supplies to repair their damage. Brandon drove into town, about 20 minutes away, to buy more supplies, batteries for flashlights, an air horn, some rope, and enough energy drinks to keep whoever was on watch awake. The day passed slowly, with this weird tension hanging over everything. We still swam in the lake, made lunch, played cards, but everyone kept scanning the tree line, looking for movement. Around 4 in the afternoon, 2 guys in a small fishing boat came close to our shore. They looked like they were in their 30s, wearing matching camo jackets even though it was 70 degrees out. They didn't fish, just drifted there for about 15 minutes, staring at our camp. When Brandon waved at them, they didn't wave back, just started their motor and headed toward the far end of the lake. Jenna took photos of them with her phone, zooming in as much as she could. Later, when we looked at the pictures, we noticed one of them had what looked like a knife sheath on his belt, the kind hunters use for skinning deer. The other guy had been holding something in his lap the whole time. We couldn't tell what it was from the photos, but it was wrapped in a dark cloth. By nightfall, we had our defenses set up. The tents were arranged in a tight triangle with the fire pit in the center, and Nathan's alarm system created a circle about 20 feet out. We agreed on 3-hour shifts, 2 people awake at all times, 1 tending the fire and 1 walking the perimeter with a flashlight. Brandon and Ashley took first watch. Nathan and I had middle shift from 1 to 4, and Claire and Jenna would handle the early morning. We tried to act normal, making dinner and talking around the fire, but everyone was on edge. Every snapping twig made us jump. Every shadow looked like a person. Around 11, just as Claire and Jenna were getting ready to sleep, we heard an engine in the distance. Headlights swept through the trees on the access road, moving slowly like before. The vehicle stopped at the same spot the couple had described, and the engine cut off. We all stood there frozen, waiting to see if someone would approach. After about 5 minutes, the engine started again, and the vehicle continued on, but none of us relaxed. The first shift passed without incident, according to Brandon, though he said they kept hearing splashing sounds from the lake that didn't sound like fish. Nathan and I took over at 1 in the morning, armed with flashlights and the air horn. Around 2:30, I was adding wood to the fire when Nathan grabbed my arm. He pointed his flashlight toward the trees, and I saw them, 2 figures standing just outside our alarm perimeter, maybe 30 feet away. They weren't moving, just standing there watching us. I grabbed the air horn and held it up, shouting that we could see them and they needed to leave. They didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then they turned and walked back into the woods. No rushing, no running, just calmly walking away like they had all the time in the world. We woke everyone up immediately, and nobody went back to sleep. We spent the rest of the night huddled around the fire, taking turns watching different directions, until the sun finally came up, and we could see the lake clearly again. We packed up everything in record time that morning, nobody even suggesting we should stay for the second night we'd paid for. While we were taking down the tents, Claire found something that made us all stop. There were fresh cuts in the fabric again, smaller this time, just 2 or 3 inches long, on the back sides of each tent where we couldn't see from the fire. These cuts were different though, arranged in patterns. 3 parallel lines on mine and Nathan's tent, a small triangle on Brandon and Ashley's, and what looked like the letter V on the girls' tent. They must have done it while we were all watching the 2 figures at the front of our camp. There had been more of them circling us, marking our tents while we were distracted. The realization that we'd been surrounded, that they'd gotten that close even with all our precautions, made everyone move even faster. We threw everything into the cars without even folding it properly, just wanting to get out of there. On the drive home, nobody talked much at first. Then Ashley pulled up local news on her phone and found something that made us pull over. 3 weeks before our trip, a family had abandoned their campsite at Silver Pine Lake in the middle of the night, after finding their tents slashed. A week before that, a couple reported similar vandalism to the Park Service. The article mentioned that rangers were investigating but had no leads. We never reported what happened to us. We just wanted to forget about it and move on. But sometimes I think about those 2 figures standing in the darkness, patient and calm, like they had done this before and would do it again. I think about the precision of those cuts, the deliberate patterns, and wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed that second night. Brandon still has the photos Jenna took of the guys in the boat, and Claire kept all her documentation, but we never did anything with them. We found out later that Silver Pine Lake was temporarily closed for maintenance 2 weeks after our trip, though I wonder if that was really the reason. None of us have been camping since. Saturday night changed everything for me, and honestly, I'm hoping someone here might have gone through something similar because I'm still trying to make sense of it all. I'm a 28-year-old park ranger in Montana, and I've been doing night hikes for years. It's part of my job to know these trails like the back of my hand. That night, I was out with my 2 buddies, Ryan and Steve, on what should have been a routine 3-hour loop through Glacier Ridge Trail. We'd started around 9 p.m., each of us equipped with headlamps, backup flashlights, and enough gear to handle any normal situation. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light through the pine trees, and the temperature was perfect for hiking, cool enough to keep you moving but not so cold that you'd need heavy layers. Everything seemed normal, even peaceful, as we made our way up the initial incline, joking about Steve's new girlfriend and Ryan's terrible taste in music. About an hour into the hike, we reached the steepest part of the trail, where the path narrows and winds between massive boulders that look like ancient sentinels in the darkness. Ryan was leading, I was in the middle, and Steve was bringing up the rear. We always kept this formation because Steve had a habit of stopping to examine random plants or rocks, and this way we wouldn't lose him. The sound of our boots crunching on the gravelly path created a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, punctuated by the occasional crack of a branch or the distant call of an owl. But then I realized that rhythm was off. Instead of 3 sets of footsteps, I was only hearing 2. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see Steve right behind me, maybe bent over looking at something with his flashlight. But there was nothing except the empty trail stretching back into the darkness, my headlamp beam catching only the dust particles we'd kicked up. "Ryan, hold up!" I called out, and heard his footsteps stop ahead of me. "Steve's not behind us." Ryan came back down the trail, his headlamp bobbing with each step, and we both stood there scanning the path with our lights. The trail behind us was completely empty. No Steve, no movement, nothing. We started calling his name, our voices echoing off the rock faces around us, but the only response was our own voices bouncing back. Ryan pulled out his phone to call Steve, but of course there was no signal this deep in the mountains. We figured he must have stopped to take a leak or wandered off the trail to check something out. Typical Steve behavior, really. We decided to backtrack, keeping our lights trained on both sides of the trail, calling his name every few seconds. The forest had gone eerily quiet. Even the usual nighttime sounds of small animals rustling through the underbrush had stopped. After about 5 minutes of walking back the way we came, Ryan grabbed my arm and pointed his light at the ground. There, clear as day in the dirt, were Steve's footprints. I recognized the distinctive waffle pattern of his hiking boots, the ones he'd bought just a week ago and wouldn't shut up about. The prints were fresh, the edges still crisp in the loose soil, and they were heading in the same direction we'd been walking. We followed them carefully, our lights focused on the ground, tracking each step. But then, right in the middle of the trail, the footprints just stopped. Not at the edge of the path, not near a rock or tree he could have climbed, but right there in the center of the trail. The last print was perfect, complete, as if he'd taken one more step and then simply ceased to exist. Beyond that point, the dirt was undisturbed, no drag marks, no signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone had been there at all. Ryan and I stood there staring at those footprints for what felt like forever, our minds trying to process what we were seeing. I got down on my knees and examined the area around the last print, running my fingers through the dirt, checking for any disturbance we might have missed. The soil was loose and would have shown any kind of movement. If Steve had jumped, we'd see the impact. If he'd been grabbed, there'd be scuff marks. Ryan started checking the trees on both sides of the trail with his flashlight, thinking maybe Steve had somehow climbed up, but the nearest branches were at least 15 feet high, and there were no marks on the bark. We expanded our search area, moving in widening circles from that last footprint, our lights sweeping through the underbrush and between the boulders. Every shadow looked like it could be Steve crouching or lying down, but each time we investigated, we found nothing but rocks and vegetation. The rational part of my brain kept insisting there had to be a logical explanation. People don't just vanish into thin air. Maybe Steve had carefully stepped backward in his own prints as some kind of stupid prank, though that didn't seem like him at all. Or perhaps there was a hidden crevice or cave entrance we couldn't see in the darkness. But the more we searched, the more wrong everything felt. Ryan suddenly pointed out something I hadn't noticed before. About 10 feet past where Steve's prints ended, our own footprints from earlier continued on, undisturbed. Mine, Ryan's, and Steve's, all 3 sets walking in formation just like we had been. Except Steve himself was gone, and his tracks showed him walking back toward us before stopping. My chest got tight as I tried to wrap my head around the impossibility of it. How could his prints from an hour ago still be there ahead of us, while he had somehow walked back and disappeared without leaving any other trace? We spent the next hour searching every inch of that area, our voices getting hoarse from calling Steve's name. Ryan even climbed up on some of the larger boulders to get a better view, shining his light down into the gaps between them. I remember the way the shadows danced and shifted with our moving lights, making every dark space look like it could be hiding something. At one point, I thought I heard Steve's voice calling back to us from somewhere up the trail. But when we stopped to listen, there was only the wind moving through the pines. Ryan heard it too, though. We both turned toward the same direction at the exact same moment. We practically ran up the trail, following the sound, our boots slipping on the loose gravel in our haste. But when we got to where we thought the voice had come from, there was nothing. Just more empty trail winding up the mountain. The worst part was that we found another set of Steve's fresh footprints there, maybe 50 yards from where the first set had ended. But these ones only went for about 10 steps before they too stopped dead in the middle of the path. My mind was racing with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. I'd heard stories from other rangers about people getting disoriented on trails, but this was different. Steve's gear was top-notch. He knew these mountains, and there was no way he could move between those two spots without leaving tracks in between. Ryan suggested we head back to the parking area, thinking maybe Steve had somehow gotten past us and gone back to the car. But as we turned to go back, we both heard it clearly this time. Steve's distinctive laugh, that weird snorting sound he made when something really amused him. It came from above us, somewhere in the canopy of trees. We pointed our lights up, scanning every branch, every shadow among the pine needles. The beam of my flashlight caught something pale about 30 feet up. It was Steve's backpack, hanging from a branch, swaying slightly in the breeze. The pack was completely intact, zipped up, with his water bottle still clipped to the side. There was no way it could have been thrown that high, and the tree trunk showed no signs of anyone having climbed it. Ryan and I stood there, necks craned upward, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The backpack just hung there, occasionally spinning slowly when the wind caught it, like some kind of twisted ornament. Ryan tried to climb the tree, but the lowest branches were too high and the trunk was too thick to shimmy up. We briefly considered trying to knock it down with rocks, but something about the whole situation made us hesitate. It felt like disturbing evidence, though evidence of what, I couldn't say. That's when we noticed something else that made our situation even more bizarre. Our phones, which had shown no signal earlier, were now displaying full bars. Ryan immediately tried calling Steve's phone and we could hear it ringing. The sound was coming from inside the hanging backpack, the screen's glow faintly visible through the fabric in the darkness. But when the call connected, all we heard was breathing, slow and deliberate, definitely human but somehow wrong. Not Steve's breathing pattern. I'd shared enough tense with him to know how he sounded. This was deeper, more measured, like someone consciously controlling each breath. "Steve, if this is a joke, it's not funny anymore," Ryan said into his phone, his voice cracking slightly. The breathing continued for a few more seconds. Then the line went dead. We tried calling back immediately, but now the phone went straight to voicemail. That's when things got truly terrifying. We started hearing footsteps circling us, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the undergrowth. But every time we pointed our lights toward the sound, there was nothing there. The footsteps would stop when we looked, then start again from a different direction the moment we turned away. They were getting closer, tightening the circle around us. Ryan and I stood back to back, our lights sweeping the forest, and that's when I saw him, or what I thought was him. Steve was standing about 20 feet away, just at the edge of our light's reach, but something was horribly wrong with how he was positioned. His body was turned away from us, but his head was twisted around at an impossible angle, looking directly at us with eyes that reflected our lights like an animal's. Before we could react, he turned and walked backward into the darkness, his head still facing us, moving in a way that human bodies simply shouldn't be able to move. Ryan and I didn't need to discuss what to do next. We ran. We ran faster than I've ever run in my life, our feet pounding down the trail, branches whipping at our faces, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind us, we could hear those footsteps keeping pace, sometimes sounding like they were right on our heels, other times echoing from the sides of the trail. At one point, Ryan tripped over a root and went down hard, and when I helped him up, I saw Steve again. This time, he was crouched on a boulder above us like some kind of gargoyle, his limbs bent at weird angles, watching us with those reflecting eyes. But it couldn't have been Steve. because at the exact same moment, we heard Steve's actual voice calling for help from somewhere behind us, desperate and terrified. The thing on the boulder tilted its head at the sound, then scuttled away into the darkness with movements that reminded me more of an insect than a person. We kept running, ignoring the cries for help that kept changing location. Sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes right beside us in the trees. We made it back to the parking area in less than half the time it should have taken, our legs shaking, our clothes soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. Ryan's car was still there, and so was Steve's truck, sitting exactly where he'd parked it. The doors were locked, his keys presumably in the backpack still hanging from that tree. We got in Ryan's car and locked the doors, trying to catch our breath and figure out what to do. That's when we saw the figure standing at the edge of the parking lot, just outside the reach of the overhead light. It looked like Steve, but he was standing completely still, arms at his sides facing our direction. We sat there for maybe 5 minutes watching this thing that looked like our friend but couldn't be, until finally Ryan started the engine. As we pulled out, our headlights swept across the figure, and for just a second, I saw its face clearly. It had Steve's features, but the expression was blank, empty, like someone had made a decent copy but forgot to add the humanity. We drove straight to the police station and reported Steve missing. They found his backpack the next morning, on the ground near the trail, all his belongings intact. They never found Steve, though they searched for 2 weeks. Ryan and I went back once with the search team in daylight, and there were no unusual footprints, no signs of the bizarre things we'd seen. The official report lists it as a probable wildlife encounter, suggesting Steve got disoriented and wandered off the trail. Ryan and I don't hike together anymore. We barely talk about that night, but I know he still has nightmares about it because I do too. Sometimes I wake up thinking I hear Steve's voice calling for help, and I have to remind myself that whatever we saw in those woods, whatever was wearing Steve's face, that wasn't really him. The smell of campfire smoke still makes me nauseous. Every time I catch a whiff of it, at a backyard barbecue from a neighbor's chimney, my whole body tenses up and I'm right back at that campsite in Redwood National Park. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, just me and the giant trees for 4 days in early June. I'd driven 6 hours from San Francisco in my old Ford Ranger, the truck bed loaded with way too much gear for one person. The divorce papers had been finalized 2 weeks earlier, and staring at code all day wasn't helping me process any of it. I needed silence, real silence, the kind you only get when you're miles away from cell towers and traffic. The park ranger at the entrance barely looked up when I signed in, just reminded me about proper food storage, and handed me a backcountry permit for Section 7, one of the more remote areas. The hike to my chosen spot took about 40 minutes, following a narrow trail that wound between trees so massive they made me feel like an ant. I picked a clearing near a small creek, one of those designated camping areas with a metal fire ring and a flat patch of dirt worn smooth by countless tents. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in these long golden beams that made everything look like a nature documentary. While I was setting up my bright orange tent, the same one my ex-wife used to complain was aggressively visible, I kept hearing these little sounds in the forest. Normal stuff, birds and squirrels, branches creaking in the breeze. By the time I had my camp stove going and was boiling water for dinner, the sun was getting low. That's when I spotted the smoke rising through the trees, maybe 200 yards away. Another fire pit, 3 figures moving around it. They weren't making any noise, which seemed odd since most campers are pretty chatty once they've settled in for the evening. I tried to get a better look while I ate my rehydrated pasta, squinting through the trees as darkness crept in. 2 men and a woman from what I could tell. They had this weird way of moving around their fire, deliberate, almost choreographed like they were following some kind of pattern. No tents that I could see, just the 3 of them standing there. The woman had long hair that caught the firelight when she turned, and one of the men was tall, really tall, maybe 6'5" or more. The shorter guy kept pacing in this tight circle, clockwise, always clockwise. I told myself they were probably just day hikers who'd stayed too late and were warming up before heading back to the parking area. But they had no backpacks, no gear at all that I could spot. Just regular clothes, jeans and dark jackets. Not exactly standard hiking attire. Around 9 o'clock, I was settling into my sleeping bag with a book when I heard footsteps outside my tent. Not the random rustling of animals, but measured, careful steps on the pine needles and dried leaves. I clicked off my headlamp and listened. The footsteps circled my entire campsite, pausing every few feet. Through the mesh window of my tent, I could barely make out a shape against the dying embers of my fire. It was the tall one from the other campsite. He stood there for what must have been 5 minutes, completely still, just facing my tent. I held my breath, trying to figure out what to do. Call out? Pretend to be asleep? Grab my knife? Then he turned and walked back toward the trees, not hurried, not sneaking, just walking like he'd been out for an evening stroll. I watched his silhouette merge with the darkness between the redwoods. I didn't sleep after that. Every sound became a threat, the creek gurgling, wind through branches, even my own sleeping bag rustling when I shifted position. I kept the knife unfolded next to my pillow and checked my phone obsessively, even though I had no signal. Around midnight, I heard them talking. Not words exactly, but these low, rhythmic sounds that carried through the forest. It wasn't any language I recognized, more like a chant or maybe even humming, but deeper and more guttural. The sound would rise and fall in waves, sometimes getting loud enough that it seemed like they were right outside, then fading until I wondered if I was imagining it. At one point, I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. Their fire was blazing now, much bigger than before, throwing wild shadows against the trees. I counted 5 people around it instead of 3. The worst part came around 2 in the morning. The chanting had stopped maybe 20 minutes earlier, and the forest had gone completely quiet. No insects, no birds, nothing. Then I heard my name. Clear as day, someone called out Daniel from the direction of their camp. Not shouting, just speaking it normally, like they were having a conversation. The thing is, I hadn't told anyone in the park my name. I'd signed the register as D. Coleman, and I hadn't talked to a single person since arriving. They called it out 3 more times, spacing it out every few minutes. Daniel. Pause. Daniel. Each time in that same conversational tone, like they were checking if I was awake. My whole body was rigid with fear, and I was gripping the knife so hard my knuckles ached. Part of me wanted to pack up right then and hike out in the dark, but the thought of walking past their camp to reach the trail made that impossible. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I must have dozed off, because I woke up to sunlight filtering through my tent. It was maybe 6:30, and for a brief moment I thought I'd dreamed the whole thing. Then I unzipped my tent and saw my backpack. I'd left it hanging from a tree branch about 10 feet away, standard practice to keep animals from getting curious. But now it was on the ground, contents scattered everywhere. My water filter, first aid kit, and food were arranged in a perfect circle around the base of the tree. My clothes were folded into neat little squares and stacked like a pyramid. Even my socks were paired and lined up by color. But the really disturbing part was my wallet. Every single card had been removed and planted in the dirt like little tombstones, all facing my tent. My driver's license was front and center, and behind it my credit cards, insurance card, even my library card, all standing upright in perfect rows. I started throwing everything back into my pack, not caring about organization, just wanting to get out of there. That's when I noticed the other thing, footprints everywhere around my campsite, dozens of them, overlapping, circling. They'd walked around my tent all night over and over. Some of the prints were bare feet, which made no sense given how cold it got. As I was cramming my sleeping bag into its stuff sack, I glanced toward where their camp had been. Nothing. No sign anyone had been there at all. The fire pit looked like it hadn't been used in weeks, full of old leaves and pine needles. I actually walked over to check, thinking maybe I'd gotten turned around, but it was definitely the same spot. The logs they'd been sitting on were covered in undisturbed moss. Even the ground where I'd seen them standing showed no signs of footprints, no disturbance at all. The hike back to my truck took less than 30 minutes. I practically ran most of the way. My pack bounced against my back, half-zipped, with random gear poking out. Every shadow between the trees made me flinch. Every bird call made me walk faster. When I finally burst out of the tree line into the parking area, there were 2 other cars there besides mine. A young couple was just arriving, pulling on their backpacks and chatting about which trail to take. They gave me weird looks, and I realized I probably looked insane. Sweaty, wild-eyed, practically sprinting out of the forest at 7 in the morning. I threw my pack in the truck bed and fumbled for my keys. As I was backing out, I saw something that made me slam on the brakes. There was a piece of paper under my windshield wiper. My hands shook as I got out to grab it. It was a receipt from a gas station in Eureka, dated 3 days ago with my credit card number on it. The same card that had been stuck in the ground at my campsite. The signature line had Daniel written in handwriting that wasn't mine. I'd never been to Eureka. I was in San Francisco 3 days ago and I had the receipts to prove it. But when I checked my phone once I got signal, there it was in my banking app, a charge for $47.83 at a Shell station in Eureka. I called the credit card company right there in the parking lot. But what was I going to say? That someone used my card while it was physically in my possession? The woman on the phone pulled up more charges. A motel in Crescent City, a diner in McKinleyville, all from the past week. All signed with my name but not my handwriting. The amounts were small, nothing that would trigger a fraud alert. She asked if I wanted to dispute them, and I said yes, but I knew how crazy it would sound. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my mirrors, convinced I'd see that tall figure standing on the side of the road, or those 3 people in another car following me. At every red light, I'd look at the cars around me, searching faces, wondering if they were watching. When I finally got back to my apartment in San Francisco, I deadbolted the door and didn't leave for 2 days. I called in sick to work, ordered groceries online, and spent hours Googling things like suspicious camping encounters and credit card fraud while camping. Nothing matched what happened to me. On the 3rd day, a package arrived that I hadn't ordered. Inside was a Forest Service map of Redwood National Park. Someone had drawn red circles around 7 different camping areas, including the one I'd stayed at. Each circle had a date written next to it. Mine had the correct date. The other 6 were all from the past 2 months. At the bottom of the map, someone had written, "Thanks for visiting," in the same handwriting from the gas station receipt. I did something I'm not proud of. I researched those other dates. Local news, missing person reports, anything I could find. 4 of the 6 dates matched up with missing hiker reports. People who went camping alone and just vanished. Their cars found in parking areas. Their campsites discovered days later with everything neatly arranged but no sign of them. The Park Service blamed it on inexperienced hikers getting lost, wildlife, the usual explanations. But I knew better. Those people at the fire pit, whatever they weren't regular campers. They were something else entirely, and they're still out there. I reported everything to the Park Service and the police, but without evidence. The footprints were just footprints. The receipt could have been a mistake. There was nothing they could do. I still have that map. Sometimes I think about the 2 dates that didn't match any missing persons reports. Maybe those people never reported what happened. Maybe they're like me, sitting in their apartments, trying to convince themselves it was all some elaborate prank while knowing deep down it wasn't. I remember that trip clearly because it was supposed to be one of the most relaxing weekends I'd had in a long time. My girlfriend at the time, Emily, had been pushing for a quiet getaway into the woods. We'd both been under pressure at work and figured a couple of nights camping by a small lake would help us reset. I wasn't an experienced outdoorsman, but Emily loved hiking, and she convinced me that being unplugged would do me some good. We packed light, just the tent, a small cooler, and the kind of gear you'd expect from people who weren't exactly survivalists. Our campsite was in a clearing that looked almost staged, like someone had chosen it years ago and kept it hidden from the world. There was enough space for our tent, a ring of stones for a fire pit, and tall pines that surrounded us in a neat semicircle. Beyond the trees, the trail cut deeper into the forest, its dirt path worn but not wide enough for anything larger than a person to walk through. It felt private, safe, even cozy in a strange way. We set up camp in the late afternoon and spent that first night cooking over the fire and listening to the silence broken only by crickets and the occasional splash from the lake. The next morning started calm. Emily wanted to hike farther down the trail to see if it connected to another part of the lake. I wasn't against it, but I moved slower than she did, and she teased me for stopping every few minutes to take in random details. The moss on fallen logs, a bird perched so still it looked fake. About 20 minutes in, though, I noticed something that didn't look like it belonged there. A small cluster of bones, pale against the dark soil. They weren't scattered the way you'd expect if an animal had been torn apart. They were lined up neatly, pointing in the same direction. At first, I thought Emily had seen it too, but she was a few steps ahead, humming to herself. I called her back, and when she crouched beside me, her expression shifted from curiosity to unease almost instantly. The bones looked like they had been arranged deliberately, each one small, maybe from a rabbit or raccoon, set end to end like a primitive arrow. Emily didn't say much, but I could tell she was unsettled. She suggested we keep walking a bit farther, see if it was just some random oddity left by another hiker. Against my better judgment, I agreed, and we followed the strange arrow deeper into the trail. The farther we went, the more unnerving it became. Every few yards, another cluster of bones appeared, sometimes just 2 or 3, other times a longer line like someone had carefully placed them there hours before. They weren't decayed or buried in leaves. They were stark, fresh-looking, like they'd been bleached in the sun, even though this trail barely got any light through the canopy. The arrangement started to feel purposeful, not random, as if someone was guiding us, or warning us. Emily stopped joking around completely. She kept glancing back toward the campsite even while walking forward. Eventually, the trail of bones shifted direction, curving slightly off the main path. That was the moment Emily insisted we turn back. She muttered something about not wanting to end up in someone's twisted idea of art. We retraced our steps, but the strange thing was that from this angle, the bones looked like they pointed the opposite way, back toward where we had set up our tent. I remember standing there trying to laugh it off, but the idea sank in. Whoever had arranged them hadn't wanted hikers to wander deeper. They'd arranged them to lead directly to us. By the time we got back to the clearing, the sun was already dropping lower, staining the sky in shades of red that made the woods feel heavier and more suffocating. Our tent looked ordinary enough, but the silence pressing down on that little clearing was different now. I half expected to see another line of bones waiting for us, but nothing jumped out at first glance. Emily grabbed my arm and whispered, "Do you see that?" I followed her gaze and noticed a small, pale shape just outside the fire ring. A single bone, clean and deliberate, lying where we hadn't seen one before. We hadn't left the camp unattended for more than an hour, and there hadn't been another soul on that trail. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but Emily thought maybe someone local was just messing with us, some weird prank to scare campers. I couldn't argue, but the pit in my chest kept growing. As night crept in, every crack of a branch or rustle in the brush sent us spinning around with the weak beam of my flashlight. The forest no longer felt quiet. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to notice whatever was coming next. That night was one of the longest I've ever lived through. The fire burned low, and every time I tried to add more wood, I swore I could hear footsteps in the brush, retreating as soon as I turned my head. Emily kept whispering that we should leave, but the thought of hiking the narrow trail in pitch black was even worse. We decided to wait until first light. Sleep was out of the question. We sat in silence, clutching the flashlight and listening to the forest breathe around us. When dawn finally broke, I felt a fleeting sense of relief. The forest looked harmless again, just trees and mist rolling off the lake. But then Emily gasped. Just a few feet from our tent, along the edge of the clearing, there was another line of bones. This time it was longer, more deliberate, snaking from the tree line straight toward where we had slept. Whoever or whatever had been leaving them had done it while we were awake, while we were staring into the dark, convinced we were alone. We packed in a rush. I barely cared if we left things behind. I just wanted out. The trail back to the car felt endless, but what shook me the most was realizing that the bones weren't only behind us anymore. As we walked, we noticed fresh ones ahead too, laid out as if predicting our path before we took it. I didn't want to say it out loud, but it felt like someone had been watching us the entire time, mapping every step we took. By the time we reached the parking lot, I couldn't get the gear into the trunk fast enough. We never went back to that lake. In fact, I haven't camped since. Emily and I eventually broke up, but sometimes we still talk, and almost every conversation drifts back to that weekend. We can't explain how anyone could have gotten so close without us hearing, or why they wanted to mark our movements with those bones. The only thing I know for sure is that someone out there wanted us to find them, and they wanted us to understand we'd been followed all along. I'd been planning that weekend with my younger brother, Daniel, for weeks. Life was stressful back then, and getting away into the woods seemed like the perfect reset. We packed light, just a small tent, a cooler, and some fishing gear. Nothing fancy, just enough to feel like we were stepping out of routine. The drive took us down back roads that narrowed into a dirt trail lined with towering pines that blocked out most of the daylight. By the time we found a clearing large enough to set up camp, the silence around us was already heavier than I expected. Daniel joked it felt like the trees were keeping secrets. Not far from where we pitched the tent, maybe a few hundred feet deeper into the trees, something metallic caught the sunlight. It looked like a dull glimmer at first, but when we walked closer, we realized it was an old van, half swallowed by brush and pine needles. The paint was more rust than color, the windows darkened with grime. Its tires were flat, one of them buried in the dirt as if it hadn't moved in years. There was no path leading to it, which made me wonder how it even got there in the first place. Daniel wanted to check inside, but the doors were locked and the handle snapped back with a stubborn click when he tugged on it. The whole thing unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Vehicles abandoned in the woods usually had a story, and not the good kind. My mind went to missing person cases I'd read about, people who vanished in remote areas, their belongings found months or years later. Daniel shrugged it off, saying it was just some hunter's junk that got left behind. But the van's presence gnawed at me. It wasn't just the way it was hidden. It felt deliberately tucked out of sight, as though someone hadn't wanted it found. That night, we built a fire and tried to distract ourselves with food and stories. But I kept glancing toward the tree line where we'd seen the van. The forest was dense enough that I couldn't make it out anymore, yet I felt its presence sitting out there, like a guest we hadn't invited. Daniel teased me for being jumpy and I laughed it off, though I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. When the crickets died down and the fire burned low, the silence pressed in so hard that every crack of a twig sounded amplified. Then, out of nowhere, two beams of light cut through the trees. Headlights, bright and unwavering, pointed straight into our campsite. Daniel jumped up first, shielding his eyes against the sudden brightness, while I sat frozen on the log we'd been using as a bench. The van was impossible to see through the glare, but I knew those lights were coming from exactly where it had been sitting. My first thought was that someone must have been inside it the entire time we'd been out here. That possibility hit me harder than anything supernatural, someone watching us for hours, waiting until it was dark enough to make themselves known. The air felt heavier, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I grabbed the hatchet we'd brought for splitting wood, though it felt ridiculously small in my hands. Daniel whispered, asking if we should yell or shine our flashlight back, but I couldn't answer. All I could think about was how silent it was around us. No engine hum, no crunch of tires, nothing but those blinding beams cutting across the trees. They didn't flicker, didn't move, just stayed locked on us. I finally muttered that we should get into the tent, but the idea of hiding in thin nylon made me feel exposed, like prey under a spotlight. Minutes dragged out, each one stretched so thin it felt like an hour. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the smoke curled through the light in pale ribbons. Daniel tried shouting, his voice cracking when he demanded to know who was out there. No reply. The lights didn't blink. My heart pounded so loudly it almost drowned out the quiet, and every instinct screamed to leave, but the trail back to the car was pitch black, and I couldn't shake the image of someone waiting along it. We stayed rooted there, caught between fight and flight, with no good option. Then, as suddenly as they'd flared on, the headlights cut out. The darkness slammed back around us, thicker than before, and I realized just how deep into the woods we really were. Daniel swore under his breath and fumbled for the flashlight, sweeping the beam through the trees, but there was nothing. No van, no sound of movement, just rows of pines standing like silent witnesses. The space where the lights had been shining looked empty, too empty, as though the forest itself had swallowed the van whole. Neither of us slept much after that. Every sound carried through the trees, an owl calling, branches creaking, and each one felt like proof that someone was still out there, just beyond the circle of our light. Daniel wanted to pack up and leave right then, but hiking back through the forest at night felt like walking straight into a trap. We ended up sitting with our backs to each other, scanning in opposite directions until the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. That faint glow was the first time all night I felt like the world hadn't caved in on us. When daylight finally spread through the clearing, the woods looked almost ordinary again, but the unease never lifted. We went straight to where the van had been, expecting to see it exactly as before. Rusted, swallowed by vines, lifeless, only it wasn't there anymore. The patch of ground was disturbed, pine needles pushed aside, and deep tracks cut through the dirt like someone had forced the thing back into motion overnight. I stared at those tire marks until my throat tightened, because I knew we hadn't heard an engine or anything move. It shouldn't have been possible. We didn't bother cooking breakfast. We shoved everything into the trunk and left in silence, neither of us wanting to be the first to admit how badly that night had shaken us. The whole drive back, Daniel kept glancing in the rearview mirror like he half expected to see headlights following us. I wanted to reassure him, but my mind kept circling back to the same thought. If that van had been abandoned for years, then who had been inside? And why wait until the dead of night to make their presence known? It's been years since that trip, and I still think about those headlights. They weren't just beams cutting through the trees. They felt aimed at us with intention, like we'd been chosen to see them. I've camped a few times since, but never in that area, and never without remembering the glow of those lights pinning us in place. People laugh when I mention it, chalking it up to some backwoods drifter messing around. Maybe they're right. But sometimes late at night when a car passes my house and its headlights sweep across my window, I'm right back in those pines, staring into that blinding glow, wondering who or what was watching us.